I only needed shelter. But this ruined workshop already knew my family's name.
She was 20 and alone. No home. No bank card. No winter coat worth naming. Just a failing blue Toyota and $41.73 she had saved from wiping tables after midnight. And with that money, she bought a condemned skylight and atrium atelier outside Portland, Middlesex County, Connecticut, a forgotten place that had fallen off town maintenance maps in 1998. The largest glass dome had caved inward over the workroom. Water ran down the walls whenever the thaw came. The county had condemned it since 2009 and was scheduled for demolition the following spring. But what nobody knew was that beneath the brick-lined drainage trench of the main atrium, in a sealed compartment that had not been opened in over 70 years, was something that would change her life forever. Before we continue, if stories like this mean something to you, hit subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love seeing how far these stories travel. Tess Calder had been waiting her whole life without knowing it. She had been the kind of child who listened before she spoke, who could sit beneath a kitchen table for an hour with a pencil and a grocery receipt, drawing the shadow of a chair leg as carefully as other children drew suns. In the apartment where she grew up, on the third floor above a laundromat in New Britain, the windows always wore a faint grey film from the dryers below. Warm lint rose through the building like weather. It gathered on the screens, settled into the corners, softened the light until every afternoon seemed older than it was. Her mother, Lillian, worked front desk at a dental office and wore cardigans with pulled cuffs. She was not unkind. That was the truth of her, and also the trouble. She could soothe a crying patient with one hand and misplace a bill with the other. She said yes to people who knew how to stand close and speak with authority. She apologized to strangers in grocery aisles when they bumped into her cart. She loved Tess in the way a person loves a lamp during a power outage, grateful for the glow, too tired to ask how the oil got there. Tess's father had been mostly a photograph. His name was Peter Calder, and in the one picture Lillian kept on the dresser, he stood in a denim jacket beside a service truck, one palm resting on a ladder, his face squinting against a pale September sun. He had repaired windows, not the fancy kind, but honest ones in schools, diners, church halls and farmhouses where the sashes had swollen in summer or gone loose in winter. He died when Tess was 4, after a second blood clot no one had expected. What remained of him were a few invoices in a cardboard folder, his last pair of leather gloves, and the way Lillian sometimes touched the kitchen window latch before a storm, as if asking it to hold. The person who taught Tess what holding meant was not her mother, and not the father she could barely remember. It was Miriam Calder, her father's older cousin, though everyone in the family called her Aunt Miriam, because cousin sounded too thin for the place she occupied. Miriam lived in an aged saltbox house near Essex, where the Connecticut River widened and the reeds turned copper in October. She was nearly 70 when Tess began spending Saturdays with her, and she had the exact posture of someone who had measured boards, cloth, bread dough, rain and silence all her life. Her hair was silver and kept in a braid wound low at the back of her neck. Her hands looked plain until they moved, then they seemed to know a private alphabet. Miriam had apprenticed as a glass cutter when she was 16, first sweeping floors in a restoration shop, then scoring waist panes, then learning how to bed glass into sash with putty that would not crack after its first winter. Later she studied lead cames and zinc bars, skylight flashing, copper gutters, and the patient making of things that were meant to meet weather directly. She did not speak of craft as decoration. To her, a window was a promise between the inside and the outside, and a skylight was a risk undertaken for the sake of light. On Saturdays, Lillian dropped Tess at Miriam's door before her shift, and Miriam always opened it with flour or putty dust on her fingers. Breakfast came first because Miriam believed no hand should hold a blade before it had held a fork. They ate toast with apple butter, then crossed the narrow backyard to the lean-to workshop, where salvaged sashes leaned against the wall like tired travellers. There was a ritual to those mornings. Miriam would lift the canvas cover from the workbench and lay out the tools in the same order every time: oil glass cutter, straight edge, glazing points, putty knife, whiting, cotton rag, a narrow brush, a roll of paper and a coffee tin filled with short pencils. Tess was allowed to sharpen the pencils with a penknife once she turned 11. She was allowed to hold the cutter at 13. She was allowed to score her first full pane the autumn she turned 14, on a piece of salvaged glass taken from a porch window in lime that had survived 3 hurricanes and 1 careless tenant. The sound stayed with her. It was not a scrape. It was cleaner than that, a quiet, deliberate hiss, like frost loosening from a branch in morning light. Miriam stood beside her, one hand hovering near but not touching, and Tess learned that pressure was not the same as force. Too little, and the glass ignored you. Too much, and it punished you. Exactness lived between those failures. They repaired storm windows for neighbours who paid in cash, eggs, firewood, once in a paper bag of pears so soft they bruised if you looked at them. Miriam made Tess write the name of each house in a ledger: street, date, pane size, weather, old damage, new work. She said memory was not reliable until you made it kneel down on paper. In late afternoons, when the work was finished and the light began angling through the trees, Miriam taught her to make scale sketches of fanlights and transoms. They studied photographs of Victorian houses from Norwich, Mystic and Wethersfield, where glass gathered above doors in half-moons and narrow-coloured borders. Tess loved the drawings most of all. She loved the geometry that did not shout, the way an arch could carry weight and still appear gentle, the way light could be guided without being captured. Miriam had one saying she used whenever Tess hurried: "Glass remembers the hand that rushed it." She said it without severity, and sometimes she said it while scraping away her own failed putty line. It meant that work carried evidence. It meant that impatience left marks long after apology had faded. It meant that a careful life was not a slow life exactly, but one that did not pretend a mistake had no shape. When Tess was 17, Miriam's breathing began to sound like paper being folded in another room. At first she blamed the damp. Then she blamed age. By November she had stopped walking to the workshop without pausing at the lilac bush halfway across the yard. The hospital in Middletown kept her for 9 days. Tess came after school with a backpack full of worksheets she never opened. Miriam smelled of antiseptic and wintergreen lozenges. Her braid had been undone, and her hair lay thin across the pillow. She asked for the workshop ledger twice. She asked whether the storm sash from the Peabody house had been delivered. She asked Tess to remember that a tool was only an old hand waiting for a new one. The night Miriam died, sleet tapped the hospital window with a sound like fingernails on a pane. Lillian stood in the hallway, speaking softly with a nurse. Tess sat in the chair beside the bed and watched the pulse line become less certain. Miriam opened her eyes once near dawn. Not widely, but enough for Tess to see that she knew where she was. "Keep the line true," she said. Those were not grand words. They were workbench words. Tess held them because there was nothing else in the room she could carry. After the funeral, the workshop did not pass to Tess. Nothing did. Miriam had meant to leave her the ledgers, the glass cutter with the worn brass barrel, the mahogany drafting box, and a leather roll of specialty knives used for easing old putty from old wood. Tess knew this because Miriam had said so over toast more than once, and because there was a sheet of paper in the desk drawer, written in Miriam's angular hand. But paper can be made to vanish when adults agree not to look for it. The cousin who handled the estate said Miriam had died without proper documents. He took the house for sale, the contents for auction, the ledgers into some carton that disappeared behind a rented van. Tess was allowed to keep one cotton rag from the workbench because it had been in her coat pocket the day of the funeral. The rag smelled faintly of linseed oil for nearly a year. She folded it into a square and kept it under her pillow. After Miriam, the apartment above the laundromat grew narrower. Lillian's new husband moved in the following spring, bringing 2 leather suitcases, a framed law diploma, a shaving mirror, and the settled air of a man who believed every room improved when people lowered their voices around him. His name was Grant Voss. He was not Tess's stepfather by affection, though the paperwork made him that by December. He was a lawyer who specialized in guardianship petitions, estate transfers, and the grey hallways where families are rearranged by signatures. Grant did not shout. He did not need to. He spoke in paragraphs. He used phrases like fiduciary responsibility and practical realities at the dinner table while Lillian cut meat into pieces smaller than necessary. He corrected Tess's grammar in birthday cards. He moved Peter Calder's photograph from the dresser to a drawer because, as he said, a household should not be governed by ghosts. He placed Tess's school art in a plastic bin under the bed and told her that hand skills were admirable but unreliable. The trust from Peter's life insurance had once existed for Tess. Lillian had mentioned it when Tess was small, calling it your father's carefulness. It was not large enough to make anyone rich, but it was enough for tuition at a community college. Enough for deposits, enough for the narrow bridge between barely surviving and not falling through. Grant learned the trust the way some men learn a lock. He did not break it, he opened it properly. There were evaluations, affidavits, medical notes and petitions that described Lillian as anxious, dependent, unable to manage complex financial decisions without support. The language looked merciful. It came dressed as concern. By the time Tess understood that concern could have teeth, her mother had signed 3 documents she would later claim not to remember signing. The money moved. First it paid for overdue debts Tess had never seen, then for legal fees, then for improvements to Grant's office on Main Street, because an office was an asset, and an asset was a family necessity. The explanations came folded in envelopes and placed beside Tess's dinner plate. She was 18 by then, working evenings at a diner near the Berlin Turnpike, cleaning syrup from laminated menus and saving ones in a coffee can. Grant told her adulthood meant adjustment. By 20, Tess had learnt the daily arithmetic of living under someone else's roof by permission. She showered before dawn so the bathroom would be open. She kept her food on the bottom refrigerator shelf in a white plastic tub. She never left shoes where they could be seen. She answered politely when Grant asked about work, school, her plans, her lack of plans, the usefulness of plans when no person of consequence had endorsed them. Lillian watched these exchanges as if they were weather beyond a window. The eviction did not come with anger. It came on a Tuesday in early October, after rain had polished the street and left the laundromat sign flickering pink against the wet sidewalk. Tess had just returned from a closing shift. Her apron smelled of fryer oil, and her feet ached in their black shoes. In the kitchen, on the table where Miriam once had helped her tape together a torn pattern for a semicircular fanlight, sat a manila envelope, her car keys, and a chipped mug filled with pencils. Grant was standing beside the sink. Lillian sat at the table with both hands wrapped around a cup of tea she had not drunk. Her face looked washed, not from crying, but from having decided not to cry before the decision was made. Grant tapped the envelope with one finger. "You have until Friday. Take only what is yours." 8 words. Neat as a legal notice. Tess looked at her mother then. Not because she expected rescue, but because the body will sometimes turn toward the place where shelter used to be. Lillian lowered her eyes to the tea. Her thumb moved once along the cup handle, a small, useless stroke, as if smoothing a thread. That was her answer. Tess carried out 2 trash bags of clothes, a backpack, the pencil mug, a shoebox of papers, and the blue Toyota's registration. Grant had arranged the rest in the hall by category, the way a careful clerk arranges evidence. Her childhood drawings were stacked with newspaper between them. Peter's gloves were gone. Miriam's cotton rag remained hidden in the lining of Tess's winter vest, where she had sewn it after graduation, not trusting any drawer that another person could open. The Toyota started on the 3rd try. For the first 2 nights, Tess slept behind the diner in New Britain, parking beneath the delivery light where the cook smoked after close. She kept the doors locked and the driver's seat tilted halfway back. The steering wheel pressed a crescent into her thigh. At 3 in the morning, the bakery truck came, and she woke with her hand around the key, listening until the footsteps passed. She still had $38 and a few coins then. By the end of the first week, she had used $12 on gasoline, 4 on coffee she made last through a whole morning, and 3 on a laundromat dryer because rain had found the crack in the rear window seal. She washed herself in diner bathrooms, public library sinks, and once at a rest stop near Sothington, where the fluorescent light hummed so loudly she could feel it in her teeth. She learned which parking lots had cameras and which had patrols. She learned that a grocery store could be too bright to sleep behind, and a church too visible. In Hartford, she parked near Bushnell Park for one afternoon and watched office workers cross the paths with paper cups in their hands. They moved with the unthinking confidence of people whose beds existed somewhere, already waiting. She ate crackers from a sleeve and counted the change in her palm, $24.19. In Middletown, the Toyota began coughing uphill. She took a waitress shift for cash at a breakfast place near Main Street, filling in for a woman whose sister had gone into labor early. The owner paid her $40 after 9 hours and gave her a container of home fries wrapped in foil. Tess sat by the river that night with the warm container in her lap, eating slowly with a plastic fork, watching dark water carry the city lights into pieces. She could have tried to call her mother. She did not. The first hard cold came while she was in Norwich. The temperature dropped after sunset, and frost spread over the windshield from the edges inward. She wore 2 shirts, a sweater, and the thin coat she had taken from the apartment, but the cold came through all of them with patient fingers. At 2 in the morning, she woke shivering so hard her teeth hurt. She started the car for heat and watched the gas needle settle lower, lower, lower. By morning, she had $17.60. The Toyota failed properly in Willimantic. In the parking lot behind a shuttered textile mill that had been converted into studios, no one seemed to be using. A belt gave a high, wounded squeal, then silence. When Tess turned the key, the engine clicked once and refused to pretend. She sat with both hands on the wheel. A man from a nearby tire shop looked under the hood and gave his estimate with kindness, which made it worse. More than the car was worth, he said. He let her leave it at the edge of the lot for 3 days. On the 4th, he wrote down the name of a salvage yard on a receipt and said they might tow it for scrap. The salvage man gave her $125 cash. Tess kept the registration until he told her she had to sign it over. She stood beside the Toyota while he hooked it to the truck, and for a moment she placed her palm on the dull blue roof. The car had been a poor shelter, but it had been hers, and it had kept its promise longer than most people. The tow truck pulled away, dragging the front wheels up, and the rear tires turned slowly over leaves. After that, Tess slept where she could. One night in a bus station in New London, sitting upright beneath a sign that said no loitering, her backpack looped through both arms. 2 nights in a hay barn outside Colchester after a farmhand found her walking along Route 16 and pointed with his chin toward the loft, saying she could stay if she was gone before milking. In the barn, the hay smelled of summer stored against winter. Mice worked in the walls. She slept under her coat and woke with straw in her hair. She moved because standing still made people ask questions. The money diminished in exact amounts: $9 for a bus ticket, $6 for socks after hers split at both heels, $2.50 for a cup of soup in a church basement where a woman with red hands pressed an extra roll into her napkin without comment, $14 for a used wool cardigan from a thrift store in Old Saybrook, $1 for a copy of her birth certificate at a town office where the clerk's perfume smelled like violets and dust. By the 6th week, Tess had $41.73. The backpack, the pencil mug wrapped in a shirt, the cotton rag, and a weariness so complete it had become practical. She no longer imagined rescue as a person. Rescue, if it existed at all, would have to be a door that did not lock behind her. She found the advertisement on a Wednesday afternoon in the public library in Waterford, after walking there to get warm. The library had broad windows and a children's mural of whales along one wall. Tess chose a table near the local papers because it was close to a radiator and because nobody bothered people who looked as if they were reading classifieds. Outside, rain darkened the pavement. Inside, an elderly man turned pages of a newspaper with a careful lick of his finger. A librarian pushed a cart between the stacks, each wheel making a soft complaint. Tess read the notices because they cost nothing. Estate sale, snowblower repair, church supper, room wanted, junk removal, firewood seasoned maple, county auction of surplus parcels and condemned structures, minimum bid $1, buyer accepts full liability, no warranties, demolition liens pending. Inquire Middlesex County Property Office, Portland Annex. Listed properties include former agricultural sheds, abandoned pump station, vacant commercial structures, and one Glassworks atelier with damaged atrium roof. She read the line once. Then she read it again. Slower? Glassworks atelier. The words did not belong among junk removal and firewood. They seemed to have slipped there from some older ledger, the kind Miriam had kept in pencil and careful columns. Tess bent closer until a strand of hair fell across the page. The notice named no owner. It gave a parcel number, a road she did not know, and the sentence, all sales final. Her fingers moved to the sewn place in her vest where Miriam's rag lay hidden. The library had a row of public computers. Tess waited for one, then typed the address into a map. The building sat outside Portland, not far from old river roads and weathered houses that still carried Victorian glass in their gables and porch roofs. It was more than 30 miles away by the route the computer suggested. There were buses for part of it, but not all. The last several miles would have to be walked. She searched the parcel number. Only 2 images appeared, both from years before. One showed a narrow brick building with a tall central roof and rows of divided windows. The other showed a faded sign hanging above double doors. Calder and Vale Skylight Works. Custom atriums. Repairs. Storm glazing. Since 1891. Tess stopped breathing for the length of one long second. Calder. It might have meant nothing. Names scattered across a state like seed. Families branched and broke and forgot their own roots. Yet she sat there in the public library, damp socks cooling inside her shoes, looking at the name her father had carried, the name Miriam had carried, the name Grant had treated as something inconvenient and already spent. The auction notice had been printed 10 days earlier. Bids closed Friday. Tess copied the address and parcel number onto the back of a receipt, folding the paper once, then twice. She checked the bus schedule, she counted her money under the table, shielding it with her sleeve. $1 was not the price of a building. It was the price of responsibility nobody else wanted. Rain struck the library windows steadily. At closing time, the librarian touched Tess gently on the shoulder, and Tess thanked her in a voice that came out rough. She put the receipt in her shoe because pockets could fail. Then she stepped outside into the cold evening and walked toward the bus stop with her backpack against one shoulder, the pencil mug wrapped inside it, and the last known directions to a place that had no reason to be waiting for her. The bus came late, its headlights blurred by rain. Tess climbed aboard, fed coins into the fare box, and took the seat behind the rear door, where the heat was weakest, but the window gave her the road. The city lights thinned. The pavement shone black. In the glass beside her, her own reflection looked like someone drawn in pencil and nearly erased. By morning, she would be in Portland, and a county clerk with a brass stamp would ask whether she understood what $1 could cost. The bus left her at a shelter with a cracked plastic roof before the sun had cleared the warehouse roofs along Route 66. Rain had become mist during the last miles, not falling so much as hanging in the air, cold enough to settle into hair and cuffs and the seams of the backpack. The driver opened the door with a sigh of brakes and did not look back after she stepped down. Behind her, the bus pulled away toward Middletown, its rear lights red and watery through the morning fog. There was no ceremony in arrival, only the narrow shoulder of the road, a damp schedule taped behind clouded plastic, a trash barrel with rain standing in its bottom, and a strip of brown grass where early frost had touched the blades white. Tess shifted the backpack higher and looked at the town waking around her with the wary patience of someone who had learned not to expect welcome from a place simply because it had sidewalks. Portland sat low and weathered beside the Connecticut River, with the kind of autumn quiet that made every sound travel farther than it should. A delivery truck backed toward a bakery door, somewhere out of sight. A dog barked twice and gave up. The air smelled of wet leaves, river mud, diesel exhaust, and the faint sweetness of bread beginning to warm in ovens. She had slept only in pieces during the ride. The night before, after the last connection failed to line up with the printed schedule, she had walked nearly 4 miles along a county road and taken shelter in a hay barn behind a dairy farm whose owner never knew she was there. The barn stood back from the road behind a stone wall, and one door had hung loose enough for a narrow body to pass through. She had climbed to the loft by feel, finding each rung with the toe of her shoe, and settled into a hollow between stacked bales while the temperature dropped to 28 degrees. The cold there had been different from the cold in the car. It came from below and above, through boards and air, through the stored stems of summer, yet the hay had held a little warmth. Mice moved like stitches in the darkness. An owl called from the edge of the fields with a voice so plain and lonely that Tess listened until she could not tell whether she was awake or only remembering the sound. Near dawn, frost silvered the inside of a broken pane, and she rubbed her hands beneath her arms until feeling returned to her fingers in needled waves. She left before the farmhouse light came on. Now, in Portland, she walked east with the paper folded inside her shoe, then stopped at the corner to take it out because the address had begun to soften from sweat and rain. The street signs were green and exact. Main Street, Marlborough Street, Freestone Avenue, names that did not ask whether she belonged. 5 businesses had already opened or were close to opening, each with its own small discipline of mourning. The first was a bakery with golden condensation on the windows and paper bags stacked like folded promises behind the counter. A woman in a blue apron was sliding trays into a glass case, and the smell of yeast reached the sidewalk, warm enough to hurt. Tess kept walking. Beside it stood a barber shop with a striped pole that turned slowly, though no customer yet sat inside. The barber, an older man with suspenders and a white mustache, swept hair from the threshold as carefully as a person sweeping a chapel. Across the street, a hardware store displayed snow shovels, storm window kits, furnace filters, and coils of rope in its front window. Farther down was a pharmacy with faded green lettering and a brass bell tied to the door handle with string. At the next corner, a cafe had chalked soup of the day onto a board, though the chalk had blurred in the wet air until the words looked half-remembered. Tess marked each place without meaning to. Food, tools, warmth, medicine, a table. The county property annex occupied a brick building set back from the sidewalk between a probate office and a shop that framed old maps. Its front steps were granite, worn lower in the middle by decades of shoes. Rain had gathered in the shallow places, a flag hung against its pole without wind. Inside the glass door, a paper sign had been taped at eye level. Surplus parcel inquiries, 2nd floor. The lobby smelled of floor wax, old heat, wet wool, and paper that had been handled by too many careful hands. A vending machine hummed near the wall. Someone had placed a rubber mat near the entrance, but it was already saturated, and Tess's shoes left dark marks beyond it, no matter how she tried to wipe them. She climbed the stairs slowly. On the 2nd floor, the hallway narrowed and dimmed. Fluorescent tubes hummed overhead. Framed notices hung along the wall. Tax deadlines, zoning meetings, stormwater permits, a faded poster explaining how to prepare a family emergency plan. At the end of the hallway was a half-open door with a frosted glass panel painted in black letters. Middlesex County Property Office, surplus, liens, deeds, records. Tess stood outside for one breath, then another. Inside 3 metal desks formed a loose horseshoe around a counter-worn pail along its edge. File cabinets stood against the far wall, each drawer labelled with block letters and year ranges. A printer clicked and settled. A clock with a schoolroom face ticked above the cabinets, the second hand making its plain circuit in the county's time, not hers. A woman at the nearest desk looked up. She was perhaps in her late 60s, compact and straight-backed, with iron-grey hair cut blunt at her chin and eyeglasses attached to a beaded chain. Her sweater was the colour of oatmeal. A narrow gold watch sat loose on one wrist. On the desk in front of her, beside a ceramic mug holding sharpened pencils, sat a nameplate the colour of old brass. Margaret E. Dunleavy, County Clerk. Her eyes moved once over Tess's coat, backpack, wet hair, and shoes. Not sharply. Accurately. Surplus parcels, Tess said. The clerk removed her glasses, wiped them with a square of cloth, and set them back on her nose. Parcel number? Tess unfolded the damp receipt and placed it on the counter, smoothing it with 2 fingers. The clerk read the number, then looked toward the cabinets with the expression of a person hearing an old story begin again in a room where it did not often visit. That one, she said. She stood, crossed to a cabinet marked Condemned Commercial Structures, 1985-2012, and pulled a drawer with both hands. The metal slid open with a low complaint. She selected a thick folder, brought it to the counter, and opened it carefully, as if even bad news deserved order. The folder contained photographs, inspection reports, lien notices, maps, tax records, and a deed so copied and rec-copied that the ink had softened at the edges. Tess could see roof, glass, brick, and shadow in the top photograph. The building looked narrower than in the online image, and more stubborn. The clerk tapped the folder once. You are here to bid. Yes. Ma'am. You understand this is not a house ready for occupancy. Yes. Ma'am. You understand the county has declared the structure unsafe. Yes. Ma'am. You understand there is a demolition lien already attached. Yes. Ma'am. You understand purchase does not cancel code violations, past taxes assigned to the parcel, or any repair orders. Yes. Ma'am. You understand there are no utilities connected. Yes. Ma'am. You understand that if you step inside and injure yourself, the county will not be responsible. The answer took longer that time, because she had been cold since before dawn and because words like responsible had followed her from room to room for years, always wearing someone else's face. Yes. Ma'am. The clerk held her gaze. Not unkindly, not softly either. You understand, she said, that a $1 property can cost more than any sensible person ought to pay. Tess looked down at the photograph in the file. Rain had found the roof then too. A dark seam ran beneath the broken dome. Vines climbed the rear wall. The old sign above the doors was split through the middle, but the letters could still be read if a person wanted to read them. Yes, ma'am. Margaret Dunleavy leaned back, fingers resting on the edge of the folder. Do you have identification? Tess took out her license. The plastic was scratched near the corner where it had rubbed against keys in the Toyota's console. The clerk copied the number by hand, not into the computer at first, but onto a yellow intake sheet. Her handwriting was severe and beautiful, each letter standing upright. There were forms, more forms than Tess expected, though later she would learn that counties kept their caution in paper. She initialed beside paragraphs stating that she accepted the parcel as is, where is. She signed acknowledgement of structural hazard. She signed notice of environmental unknowns. She signed agreement to secure the property within 30 days. She signed a receipt for disclosures, though the disclosures themselves contained more absence than knowledge. No recent survey. No current occupancy permit. No warranty of roof integrity. No guarantee of access. No assurance that any remaining personal property could be retained. The clerk read each page aloud in a low, steady voice. Tess answered when required. The clock went on ticking. Somewhere beyond the wall, another employee laughed once. Then a phone rang and silenced it. Rain traced thin lines down the window behind the file cabinets. At last, Margaret Dunleavy took a blank deed form from a tray, rolled it into the typewriter on a side table, and began to fill in the formal language. The machine's keys struck with clean, deliberate force. Tess had not seen a typewriter used outside of old movies and courthouse storage rooms. Here it seemed less like nostalgia than refusal. The letters appeared one at a time, dark and permanent, each impact making the desk tremble faintly. When the deed was ready, the clerk placed it on the counter, turned it toward Tess, and uncapped a black pen. "Legal name here," Tess signed. The signature looked thin, dragged slightly by the dampness of her sleeve. Margaret took the paper, inspected it, then opened a drawer and removed a brass stamp mounted on a wooden handle. She pressed it into an ink pad the colour of dried blood and brought it down on the deed with a sound that filled the office more completely than the typewriter had. Thump. The deed had become a fact. The clerk counted Tess's payment into a metal cash box. One bill, the smallest possible exchange a county could accept for something it no longer wanted to carry. Margaret wrote a receipt, tore it along the perforation, and slid it across the counter with the deed copy and a ring holding 2 dull keys. "These may not open anything," she said. "They are what we had." Tess closed her hand around them. The keys were colder than the room. Margaret took out a town map and marked the route in pencil. "You will follow Main South until it bends toward the river, then take Bartlett Street past the cemetery. You will cross Job's Pond Road, then keep to the right where the pavement narrows. The atelier sits beyond the old quarry spur. Before the tree line thickens, there is no county sign. If you reach the marsh culvert, you have gone too far." Tess repeated the directions under her breath. The clerk heard her. "Say them again before you step out," she said. Tess did. Main, Bartlett, Job's Pond, Quarry Spur. Before the tree line, not as far as the marsh culvert. That will do. There was a pause then, the kind that gathers when business has concluded but one person has not yet released the other. Margaret slid the folder closed, yet her hand remained on top of it. "Your surname," she said. Tess waited. The clerk's eyes moved to the deed, then to Tess's face, then back to the file. There was a Calder tied to that property. Once, more than one, by the look of it. This folder is not complete. County folders rarely are, but I remember a woman who used to come through here to check filings for historical sash permits. She had a way of correcting our terminology without making enemies. The room seemed to become still around the sentence. Tess did not speak. If she opened her mouth too quickly, she knew something unguarded might come out. Margaret adjusted the corner of the folder until it aligned with the counter. She brought lemon cookies one winter. Said clerks saved more buildings than architects, because clerks knew where the papers slept. There it was. Not the full name. Not the whole person. Only the edge of a life passing through another life and leaving a crumb of proof behind. Tess placed her thumb over the keyring and pressed until the metal hurt. "She taught me Windows," Tess said. Margaret's face changed very slightly. It was not surprise. It was recognition arriving late, after walking a long hallway. "I thought she might have," the clerk said. The clock ticked again. Margaret opened the folder once more and pulled free a photocopied map older than the others. Its edges, browned from storage. She folded it into thirds and tucked it beneath Tess's deed copy. "This is not part of the sale packet," she said. "It is only a copy of a copy. The drainage plan is probably wrong by now, and the roof has changed since the drawing was made. But take it." Tess touched the paper but did not lift it yet. "Can you do that?" The clerk's mouth tightened in a manner that might almost have become a smile if it had chosen a warmer room. "I can give a buyer a photocopy of an archival drainage plan for a condemned structure," she said. "The county will survive my generosity." Then she opened another drawer, removed a plain envelope, and placed the original $1 bill inside before writing the parcel number across the front. She did not put it into the cash box. Tess noticed. Margaret noticed her noticing. "Some sales deserve a drawer," the clerk said. She stood then and came around the counter with a brown paper bag from beneath her desk. Inside were 2 cheese crackers, an apple and a folded napkin. The bag was not offered as charity. It was offered with the same manner as the deed, as if it too belonged to the transaction and had merely been misplaced until now. "Road is longer than it looks," Margaret said. Tess took the bag with both hands. "Thank you." The clerk returned to her chair. "Lock what locks. Do not stand under the dome. If you smell gas, leave, though there should be none. If the rear floor feels soft, believe it. And if anyone tells you the building is beyond saving, remember that most people say that about anything they do not have to save themselves." Tess folded the deed, map, and receipt into the inner pocket of her coat. The keys went into her fist. The paper bag went under one arm. At the door she turned back, because gratitude had gathered behind her ribs and she did not know where to put it. Margaret had already opened another file. Still, without looking up, she said, "Go before the rain hardens." Outside, the morning had deepened into a grey noon. Tess walked the route exactly, because exactness was the closest thing she had to safety. Main Street bent past houses with porches and wet pumpkins softening at their stems. A white steeple rose above bare maple branches. The river showed itself between buildings in pieces of dull pewter. She passed the bakery again, then the hardware store where a man was carrying a bucket of salt to the entry and spreading it with a scoop, though no ice had formed yet. A few blocks farther, the town thinned. Bartlett Street climbed gently, then settled. Houses stood farther apart, some with Victorian brackets under the eaves, some with enclosed porches wearing panels of coloured glass in amber green and smoke blue. Tess slowed at those windows without meaning to. Even through rain the glass held light differently, not brighter but deeper. Someone had once cut those pieces, fitted them, bedded them against weather, and trusted the work to outlast the hands. A brown dog behind a split-rail fence watched her pass without barking. Its head followed the swing of her backpack, ears lifted in solemn curiosity. A woman in a red raincoat came down a driveway carrying mail and stopped just long enough to look at Tess's face, then at the direction she was walking. The woman gave one small nod. Not welcome, not warning, something between. Past Job's Pond Road, the pavement narrowed as Margaret had said. The shoulder disappeared. Tess walked close to the stone wall where wet leaves had plastered themselves flat against the rocks. Walnut trees grew along a shallow ditch, their branches black and angular against the low sky. The fallen nuts had split under tires, leaving dark stains in the road and a smell both bitter and green when stepped on. A pickup passed slowly. The driver, an elderly man in a canvas cap, lifted 2 fingers from the wheel. Tess lifted her hand back. After he passed, the road seemed even quieter, as if the engine had taken the last ordinary sound with it. She ate the apple walking, the cheese crackers she saved. At the quarry spur, an unmarked gravel track angled away behind a rusted gate that hung open on one hinge. Beyond it, the land dipped slightly. Weeds had grown through the gravel in long seams. A line of sumac burned red along the ditch, bright even beneath rain. Tess stopped at the gate, took out the deed again, checked the parcel sketch, and felt the paper soften beneath her thumb. Then she saw the roof. Not all of it, only the upper curve of the central atrium rising beyond a stand of cedar and walnut, its damaged ribs making a dark shape against the sky. At first it looked like the skeleton of a conservatory, something meant for plants and winter light. Then the building appeared below it as the track curved brick by brick, window by window, more modest and more ruined than any photograph had been willing to admit. The atelier stood long and narrow, about 60 feet from front to back, and perhaps 30 across, built of red brick laid in common bond, with pale mortar that had gone sandy in places. A fieldstone foundation lifted it slightly from the damp ground. The front had double wooden doors under a shallow iron canopy, one door sagging inward, the other chained through its handle. Above them hung the sign from the old photograph, split through its painted centre but still readable in pieces. Calder and Vale, Skylight Works, custom atriums. The lower windows were tall and divided into many panes, most clouded, several cracked, two boarded from inside. Along the right wall a brick chimney rose with a lean so slight that one might ignore it in kindness, but not in weather. The roof over the front room had slate shingles, many missing near the ridge. The central atrium behind it rose higher, framed in corroded metal ribs that had once held panes of glass in a broad, shallow dome. Now whole sections were open to the sky, and blue plastic sheeting from some past emergency repair had torn loose and tangled in the frame like a flag surrendered to storms. Water fell inside. She could hear it before she entered, the steady drip and splash from the broken dome into whatever room lay beneath. A narrow brick drainage trench circled the base of the atrium wall outside, half filled with leaves, walnut shells and silt. Downspouts, long disconnected, hung like broken arms from the eaves. There was a rear lean-to with a collapsed corner and a rusted stovepipe. Near the front, a lilac bush had grown so wide it pressed against the brick, its bare branches tapping in the rain. Tess stood in the gravel, looking. No one came out to tell her she could not stay. No one came out to tell her she could. She tried the first key on the padlock. It did nothing. The second key entered halfway and stopped. She withdrew it, wiped it on her coat, tried again, and felt the old mechanism shift with reluctance. The lock opened into her palm with a dry click that seemed too small for the moment it served. The chain fell loose. The sagging door resisted. Its bottom edge had swollen and dragged against the threshold. Tess put her shoulder to it, pushed once, then again. The wood gave a reluctant groan. Damp air came out, close and cold, carrying the smell of brick dust, mildew, rust, wet paper, and something mineral beneath all of it, like rain trapped inside stone. She stepped into the front room. The first sensation was not sight but temperature. The building held cold differently than outside, not moving across the skin, but waiting against it. Her breath showed faintly. Rain tapped somewhere overhead and answered itself in buckets, puddles, metal pans and open floor. The front room had been an office once. A counter ran along the left wall, its surface bowed but still attached. Behind it, wooden pigeonholes held curled invoices, dead leaves, a bird's nest, and one glass marble dark with dust. A cast-iron stove stood in the corner on a square of cracked tile. Beside it was a stack of split wood, so old the bark had loosened. On the right wall hung framed drawings under grime-clouded glass. Tess moved closer without touching them. Cross-sections of skylight ribs, drainage slopes, flashing details, a fan-shaped atrium roof drawn in pencil and ink, its measurements precise even beneath the water stains. The signatures at the bottom had faded. She could not make them out in the dimness. The floorboards complained but held. She took 3 more steps. The back room opened beneath the damaged dome, and there the building seemed to be both inside and outside at once. The atrium rose above her in a dark curve of metal ribs, broken glass, torn sheeting and sky. Rain fell through several openings, striking a broad work table at the centre and running from its edges in 4 steady streams. Buckets had been set out years before, but 2 had overflowed, 1 had rusted through, and 1 lay on its side beneath the table, ringing softly each time a drop struck it. The room was larger than she expected, square and high, built for tall work and clear light. Along one wall were racks for flat glass, most empty, a few still holding panes wrapped in brittle paper. Along another stood forms and curved templates for arches, half circles, lantern roofs and narrow transoms. There were clamps, sawhorses, metal ribs, Coils of old zinc came, soldering irons, a bench vise, putty knives, glazing points, chalk lines, rolls of rotted felt, and a cabinet whose drawers had swollen shut. The place was not abandoned in the way a field is abandoned. It was paused. A mug sat on the rear sill, cracked down the side. A pencil lay beneath the workbench, its point broken. Someone had nailed a calendar to the wall near the back door. The pages had curled so badly she could not read the month. On a shelf near the chimney, 2 jars of whiting had hardened into stone. Every object seemed to have stopped in the middle of being useful, waiting for a hand that had stepped away and never returned. Tess set her backpack on the driest part of the office floor. The act made the building hers in a way the deed had not. She spent the next hour moving slowly through the rooms, not exploring so much as listening. The front office had 2 windows still intact enough to block the wind. The back room had no chance of warmth until the dome was covered. A narrow door near the stove led to a washroom with a cracked basin and no water. Another door, swollen nearly shut, opened into a storage alcove where shelves sagged under old cans, bolts, and bundled strips of metal. The rear exit had been barred from inside with a plank. She left it that way. No electricity. No running water. No working lock except the front chain. She returned to the office, closed the double doors as far as they would go, and looped the chain through the handles from inside. It would not stop anyone determined, but it made a sound when moved. Sometimes a sound was enough. The first night came early. Rain turned to a hard patter after dusk, then softened again. Tess gathered wood from the stack beside the stove, but she did not light it. The chimney might be blocked, the stove might smoke. The building had enough warnings without her adding fire to them on the first evening. She ate the cheese crackers from Margaret's bag, one at a time, sitting on the floor with her back against the counter. The crackers tasted of salt and paper. She drank from the last water bottle in her backpack. She changed into dry socks behind the counter, hanging the wet pair over a drawer pull, though she knew they would not dry by morning. From the pencil mug she took 1 short pencil and placed it beside the deed. Then, because Miriam had taught her that memory must kneel on paper, she began a list on the back of the county map. Front lock poor. Dome open. Water active. Office floor mostly sound. Stove unknown. Chimney unknown. Glass racks possible. Tools present. Drainage trench blocked. She paused after writing that last line and listened to the water outside the wall, moving somewhere under leaves and silt. The drainage plan Margaret had given her lay folded beside her knee. Tess did not open it yet. She was too tired to receive another fact. Later she dragged a sheet of plywood from the alcove, wiped it as best she could with her sleeve, and laid it behind the counter where the floor stayed driest. Her coat became a blanket, her backpack became a pillow. She placed the keys beneath her hand, not because she feared losing them in the room, but because she needed to feel that some metal proof of the day had not vanished. Darkness gathered in layers. The broken dome admitted a faint square of evening sky into the rear room, and then even that disappeared. The building began making night sounds: water, settling brick, a loose strip of plastic ticking against metal, the far creak of a branch against the roof. Once something small moved inside the wall and stopped when Tess lifted her head. She did not sleep quickly. Cold rose through the plywood. The office smelled of damp ledgers and long-shut drawers. Wind found some crack near the door and touched her face at intervals, as if checking whether she remained. Yet no one ordered her out. No hand removed her bag. No key turned against her from the other side. Near midnight, the rain thinned. Through the broken place behind the office wall, one narrow shaft of moonlight slipped through the atrium roof and landed across the floorboards, pale and exact as a measured line. Tess watched it without moving. It crossed the threshold between the office and the workroom, touched the leg of the central table, and lay there among rust, water, and glass dust, as if marking where a beginning might be cut. She closed her fingers around the keys. The house had been waiting. At daybreak, Tess learned that water had its own map of the building. It entered through the broken dome, through 3 missing slates near the front ridge, through a hairline crack above the north window, and through the brick joint where the chimney met the wall. It ran openly in some places and secretly in others. It made bright trails over grime, darkened plaster without dripping, collected inside warped boards, then appeared 10 feet away with the innocence of something newly arrived. She followed it with the pencil, not because she could stop it yet, not because a list was a roof, but Miriam had taught her that every repair began by noticing where the damage entered and where it rested. So Tess walked the office and workroom in the weak grey light, marking the county map with arrows, X marks, and short words that could fit in the margins. Active drip. Soft sill. Wall stain. Bucket needed. Trench blocked. At 9, she took the empty water bottle and walked back along the road toward the nearest public spigot Margaret had marked on the map with a question mark. It turned out to be behind the cemetery office, beside a maintenance shed where rakes hung on nails and a blue hose had been coiled for winter. A groundskeeper in a brown knit cap saw her filling the bottle and did not ask for an explanation. He only said the tap might be shut off after Thanksgiving, so she should not count on it past then. "I won't," Tess said. The words came out plain. She knew better than to count on anything not written, nailed, carried, or repaired by her own hands. There was an outhouse behind the old quarry spur, half hidden by sumac and a tangle of wild grape. Tess found it because the county drainage map had shown a small square marked privy, though the building itself had tilted so far left that entering it felt like agreeing with a bad idea. The door still closed, the roof still covered most of what needed covering. A wasp nest hung empty in the corner like grey paper folded by a careful hand. She cleaned it before using it. That was how the first morning passed, fetching water, clearing the outhouse floor with a broken broom, moving 3 intact buckets beneath the heaviest leaks, dragging wet cardboard out of the office, and carrying a rusted trash can outside where rain could finish what neglect had begun. The labour warmed her in pieces. Her hands went red, then pale, then red again. By noon, the cheese crackers were gone, and the building had given up 2 things she could use, a bent enamel cup and a tin of matches kept dry in a drawer lined with mouse-chewed newspaper. She did not light a fire. The chimney still waited. On the second day, she learnt the floor. The front office had a pattern, a language of boards and joists that could be crossed safely if respected. The first 4 feet inside the door held firm. The boards near the counter creaked, but did not dip. The northeast corner, where rain had entered from the window, answered her weight with a low softness she did not test twice. She placed an overturned crate there as a warning to herself. The threshold into the workroom groaned like an old throat, but held. 3 boards near the central table had lifted at their ends, and 1 nail head stood proud enough to catch the sole of her shoe. The west side of the atrium floor sounded hollow under light tapping. The east side sounded dense and dull. Tess marked both with chalk she found in a drawer, writing no beside one patch, slow beside another, safe beside a third. By the 3rd day, she could cross the building in darkness without stepping where the floor objected. She knew which door moved loudly, which drawer stuck, which pane rattled in wind, and which bucket filled fastest. She knew the sound of rain striking glass, metal, wood, paper, water, and dirt. She knew that a squirrel used the broken cornice as a highway at dawn. She knew that the chimney smelled worse when damp air fell down it, which meant it was open at least somewhere above the stove. She knew that the old office counter, though bowed, could hold her folded coat and backpack without giving way. She slept poorly but more deeply each night. Not safely. Only less newly. On the 4th morning, hunger took on a practical shape. Tess counted the money left after the deed fares and the last bus connection. She had enough for food or hardware, not much of both. Food lasted hours, tools might last years. That calculation would have frightened her before, but the building had begun to narrow her thinking in a useful way. It asked only what must be done next. She walked into town beneath a low sky the colour of pewter. The hardware store she had passed on arrival was called Harkness & Son. though the sign had been repainted so many times that the ampersand looked newer than the names around it. The front windows were dense with useful things: storm window plastic, brass hinges, kerosene lanterns, stove rope gasket, shims, cork, ice melt, drill bits, cotton clothesline, pruning saws, and one bright display of work gloves Tess looked at longer than she meant to. A bell fastened above the door rang once when she entered. The store held warmth carefully, not the open heat of a cafe, but the steady dry warmth of a place with ceiling vents, wood shelves, and people who understood winter as an adversary requiring inventory. The floorboards were worn darker along the aisles. A long counter stood at the back, scarred by decades of keys, bolts, paint cans, and elbows. Behind it, drawers climbed to the ceiling in banks labelled with black script: nails, screws, washers, hinges, sash cord, tacks, glazier points, stove fittings, pipe nipples, escutcheons, brass hooks. The man behind the counter looked up from repairing a lamp cord. He was broad through the shoulders and narrow through the face, perhaps in his early 70s, with white hair cropped close, and eyebrows still dark enough to look penciled in. One lens of his glasses had a small chip near the rim. He wore a canvas apron over a red flannel shirt, and his hands were stained with machine oil at the creases. "Morning," he said. "Morning." He waited. Not impatiently. A store like that taught a person to let customers find the words that had brought them. Tess placed the county map on the counter. "I bought the Glassworks outside the quarry spur." The lamp cord lay still in his hands. "You did?" "Yes, sir." He took off his glasses, breathed on one lens, and wiped it with his apron. "Name?" "Tess Calder." At that, he looked not at the map, but at her face, carefully, as Margaret had done, but with a different kind of memory behind it. "Harkness," he said after a moment. "Eli Harkness. My father sold putty to that shop. His father sold coal oil to it before that. I was a boy when the last real skylight went out of there." Tess did not know what to do with all these people who remembered pieces of what her own family had lost. She folded her hands around the edge of the map so they would remain steady. "I need to make it not worse," she said. "I cannot make it good yet." Eli Harkness nodded once. "That is the first honest sentence I have heard about that building in 20 years. He came around the counter and walked with her through the aisles, not selling, only naming what could wait and what could not. Fire could not be started until the chimney was checked. Water had to be guided before it was beautified. Broken glass overhead had to be respected, as if it were loaded. A rooftop was temporary, but sometimes temporary was the bridge between ruin and repair. At the back counter, Tess took out her remaining bills and laid them flat. "I can pay some now," she said. "Not all. I can work. I can clean. I can keep account." Ellie looked at the money without touching it. "No credit cards." "No." "Sir." "Bank." "No." "Sir." "Phone?" "Sometimes, if the library lets me charge it." He did not sigh. He did not soften his voice. That was a kindness. "My father kept a hardware ledger," he said. "People paid by harvest, by pension check, by selling a calf, by finishing a porch for someone else. I do not do it often now. People mistake credit for permission to forget. I won't forget. I expect not." He took a black ledger from beneath the counter. It was not decorative. The spine had been repaired with tape, and the pages had the grey edges of paper touched by many fingers. He turned to a fresh line, wrote her name. Then the parcel road. Then account opened. Under terms he wrote, "Pay when able." No waste. Then he slid a small paperback across the counter. The cover showed a man in rolled sleeves standing beside a brick chimney with a brush and rods. Chimney cleaning, stove safety, and small masonry repairs for owner-occupied structures. Revised 1976. The corners were soft. A coffee ring marked the back. "This is free," Eli said, "because nobody can sell a book that smells like raccoon." Tess took it with care. "I will bring it back." "No. You will make it dirty, which is what a manual is for." He started a list with a carpenter's pencil on brown paper, writing item, price, and purpose in 3 columns so there could be no confusion. Used 6-foot stepladder, cracked paint but sound hinges, $6, 5-gallon galvanized bucket, dented, $2.50, stove pipe brush, 6-inch round, used once and returned, $3, 2 extension rods, $1 each, dust mask, 49 cents, leather palmwork gloves from the mismatched bin, hand broom, 75 cents. Cold chisel, used, $1.25. Mason's hammer, handle taped, $2. Roll of 6mm clear plastic sheeting, damaged box, $4. 50-foot cotton clothesline, $1.10. Box of roofing nails, opened, $1.35. Tin of glazing points, 90 cents. Half can linseed oil, labels stained, $1. Putty knife with loose handle, 60 cents. 3 cans of beans, dented, 30 cents each. 1 pound bag of cornmeal, 45 cents. Small sack of apples, bruised, 60 cents. He stopped before the total became cruel. Tess watched his pencil. "That is more than I can pay today. I can add." "I know. I mean I can add slowly." He made the total anyway, because exactness mattered more when money was thin. $29.29. Tess paid $7 and kept enough for bread, matches, and 1 bus ride if disaster required leaving. Eli wrapped the brush and rods in newspaper, tied the plastic sheet with twine, and found a flour sack for the food. Then he took from beneath the counter a folded photocopy of 2 pages from the manual. "Read the chimney chapter 3 times before you put a brush in anything," he said. "Once to understand it, once to doubt yourself, once to find what you missed." Tess almost smiled. "Yes, sir. And do not climb the atrium frame." "I won't. Do not stand under any hanging glass." "I won't. If you find dead animals in the flue, you stop and come tell me." Tess considered this. "I would rather not find dead animals. So would most people. The animals do not consult us." He packed the last item and set the bundle on the counter. When Tess lifted it, the weight pulled hard on one shoulder, but she did not complain. Ellie watched her adjust the load. "Calder glass was good," he said. She looked up. He had turned back to the lamp cord, but his hands were not moving. "Not pretty first," he added. "Good first. Pretty only if good allowed it." That sounded so much like Miriam that Tess had to look toward the door before her face betrayed her. The bell rang when she stepped out, carrying more weight than she had brought in and less uncertainty than she had carried for years. The chimney took 2 days because the first day was mostly reading. Tess sat on the office floor with the manual open on her knees, turning pages slowly, mouthing terms until they settled. Creosote, flue tile, smoke shelf, damper, firebox, draft, spark arrestor, chimney cap, clearance, backpuffing, obstruction. She drew the stove and chimney in the margin of the county map, guessing the hidden path from firebox to roofline, then checking it against what she could see. The old cast-iron stove was a box stove with a round pipe entering the chimney through a thimble in the brick. The stovepipe itself came apart in sections after she loosened 2 rusted screws with the putty knife and patience. Inside was soot, yes, but not the packed black gloss the manual warned about. That was hopeful. The pipe joints were thin at their lower edges, but not broken. The damper plate moved after she worked it back and forth with gloved hands for nearly 20 minutes. The chimney throat was worse. She spread the plastic sheeting over the floor around the stove, weighting the corners with bricks. She tied a damp rag over her hair, put on the dust mask, and fitted the brush to the first rod. Before pushing upward, she opened the manual again. Never force against an unknown obstruction. Work from bottom when roof access is unsafe. Listen for change in resistance. Protect eyes. Expect falling debris. She had no goggles. She narrowed her eyes and turned her face aside. The first push brought down a soft fall of soot that made the plastic whisper. The second push struck something that did not belong. Tess withdrew the brush, tapped the rod, listened, then tried again with less pressure. A clump fell. Then another, then a shower of black flakes, twigs, and the dry bones of a nest. No animal body, no smell of rot, only old bird work, packed deep and forgotten. She worked in slow increments. Push. Twist. Withdraw. Tap. Empty debris. Add rod. Push. Twist. Listen. The motion turned her shoulders to rope. Soot entered the cuffs of her sleeves and settled behind her ears. The dust mask grew damp from her breath. After an hour, the room seemed darker, though the afternoon had not changed. She stopped twice to walk outside and cough into the wet air. By the third hour, the brush reached higher and began moving more freely. That did not mean the chimney was safe. The manual had underlined that in someone else's hand long before Tess owned it. A clean passage was not the same as sound masonry. She went outside with the ladder and set it against the front wall, not to climb onto the roof, but to see the chimney from as high as she could reach without stupidity. The top courses were weathered. Mortar had powdered along one side. The cap was cracked, but daylight showed through the flue when she angled a mirror from below later, using the dented bucket filled with water to catch a dim reflection. Daylight. That small square of pale light at the top of the dark chimney felt less like victory than permission to proceed carefully. The second day she cleaned the stovepipe sections one by one outside, brushing them over the gravel until soot fell like black flour. She scraped the firebox, cleared the ash pan, inspected the grate for cracks, and rubbed the door gasket with her thumb. The rope was brittle but still present. She would need a new one. Not today. At dusk she rebuilt the pipe, fitting each seam in the direction the manual instructed so soot would fall inward rather than leak outward. She tightened the screws with the putty knife. She carried in only 3 small splits of the old wood and shaved curls from one with Miriam's remembered motion, though she had no proper knife and used the edge of the chisel badly. The first match failed. The second match caught the paper, and the paper caught the shavings. And the shavings considered the matter for several long seconds before accepting flame. Tess crouched with her hands on her knees. Smoke lifted, hesitated at the pipe, then moved inward. The draught took it. A thin line disappeared into the chimney without coming back into the room. Tess did not add more wood. She waited for the first pieces to burn clean, watching the stove body warm from black to a different black, one with life inside it. Only when no smoke entered the office did she place the smallest split across the coals. The room did not become warm quickly. That would have been asking too much of iron, brick, and November damp. But near the stove, within an arm's reach, the air changed. Cold loosened its fist. Her fingers stopped aching. The wet socks on the drawer pull began to steam faintly. She opened one can of beans with an old church key found in the pigeonholes, poured them into the enamel cup, and set the cup on the stovetop. They warmed unevenly, scorching at the bottom before the centre surrendered its chill. Tess stirred them with the handle of a spoon she had found behind the counter, wiped clean and kept. Then she sat on the floor with the cup wrapped in her sleeve, eating slowly. The beans tasted of tin, smoke, and salt. They were the first hot meals she had eaten inside a place that belonged to her. That night, she slept 3 feet from the stove after letting the fire die down to ash. Warmth remained in the iron for an hour. She woke twice to check for smoke, once to wind, once to the sound of water. Each time the building was still there, colder again but not hostile, damaged but not gone. On the 6th day, she began the inventory. She approached the workroom like a clerk, not a treasure hunter. That distinction would matter later. The room had been left in confusion, but not entirely in neglect. Time had damaged it, water had damaged it, mice, rust and damp had taken their portions. Yet beneath those losses, the original order showed like handwriting under an erasure. She made columns in the back of the manual. West wall, glass rack, A7 full panes. Flat, likely 1/4 inch, wrapped in brown paper, 2 cracked, 1 greenish with bubbles, do not move alone. Glass rack B, empty except 1 narrow frosted pane, 28 by 6 inches, chipped corner. Template hooks, 8 wooden arch templates, labelled in faded pencil. Half round, 36 inches. Half round, 42. Ellipse, parlour roof. Lantern hip, porch barrel. Small fanlight, below hooks, bundle of zinc bars, oxidized white, tied with cotton cord, 6 pieces salvageable. South bench, bench vise. Rusted but jaws move 1/8 inch after oil. 2 soldering irons. Copper heads. Wooden handles loose. Ladle. Cracked lip. Box of glazier points. Mouse nest inside. Points still usable after sorting. 3 putty knives, 1 stiff. Flex. Vone broken at tang. Oiler. Empty. Small brass plumb bob. Line rotted. Roll of paper patterns. Water damaged beyond first 6 inches. East cabinet. Top drawer stuck. Second drawer stuck. Third drawer opens. Chalk. Pencils. 2 brass hinges. Loose screws. Envelope marked Vale invoices. 1951. Fourth drawer swollen shut. Lower compartment. 2 cans whiting, hardened, 1 tin boiled linseed oil, skin on top but liquid beneath, 1 jar blackened tacks, 1 folded apron stiff with dust. North shelf. Wooden forms for skylight curb corners. Metal brackets. Assorted. 4 lengths copper flashing. Bent but sound. Tin labelled zinc clips. Coil of old cotton sash cord. Mason jar of marbles used for weights or a child's visit. Calendar with month missing. Year visible only as 1953 on a printer's line. Central table. Surface water damaged. 1 corner delaminated. Scorch mark near middle. Clamp rail intact. Drain hole board near south edge. Beneath table foot treadle. No belt. Iron frame bolted to floor. Purpose unknown. The act of naming steadied her. Each object moved from threat to task once written. She did not romanticize them. A rusted tool was still rusted. A cracked pane was still dangerous. But there was an honesty in inventory that she had been hungry for. Nothing in the room pretended to be other than it was. Even rot declared itself eventually. She spent 2 afternoons sorting what could cut from what could hold, what could be cleaned from what must wait, what belonged to glasswork from what belonged to building repair. She found a crate of old newspapers from the Hartford Courant, used as packing, the top page dated March 1957. She found 3 empty tobacco tins, a button hook, a broken folding rule, and a woman's hairpin bent into the shape of a hook. She found mouse-chewed invoices bearing names of houses from towns Miriam had once made Tess copy into ledgers. Essex, Guildford, Old Lyme, Wethersfield, Mystic, names like panes of glass arranged in a long, unseen window. The anomaly announced itself not by sight, but by sound. On the 9th morning rain stopped entirely for the first time since she had arrived. The sudden lack of dripping made the workroom seem larger, almost embarrassed by its own silence. Tess used the dry hours to clear the brick drainage trench at the base of the atrium's interior wall. She had mistaken it at first for a shallow channel, only meant to catch water from the dome. The drainage plan Margaret had given her showed more complexity. A brick-lined trench sloped toward an underground drain, with removable cedar cleanout discs set at intervals beneath the inner curb. Most discs were gone. One remained. It sat near the southwest curve of the atrium, half hidden beneath silt, broken putty, leaves, and a layer of black muck that smelled of wet mineral and old roof water. Tess uncovered it with the hand broom and the putty knife. The disc was cedar, darkened almost to brown iron by age, about 14 inches across, fitted into a circular brick surround. A small brass pull ring lay flat in its centre, green with corrosion. She brushed it clean. Then she tapped the bricks around it with the wooden handle of the hammer. Dense, 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 hollow. She stopped. Tapped again. The 4th brick, just left of the cedar disc, gave a lower note than the others. Not empty exactly, but different, as if the wall behind it held breath. She moved outward and tapped each brick in a careful arc. 3 answered dull, 2 answered ordinary. 1 near the trench floor made the hammer handle return a sound so soft she felt it more in her wrist than heard it. Tess sat back on her heels. Buildings changed sound when they hid damage. Hollow could mean rot. It could mean washed-out mortar, animal burrow, collapsed drain, void under the floor. She had no reason to think it meant anything kind. She performed a weight test because the manual had warned against trusting sound alone. First she placed the mason's hammer on the cedar disc. Nothing moved. Then the cold chisel, then the dented bucket half filled with water, set near the ring rather than on it. The disc did not tilt. Water in the bucket trembled slightly from the floor, then stilled. She pressed one hand near the edge. The cedar gave less than expected. The ring resisted at first. She worked oil into it from the half can, though the oil had thickened and smelled strong enough to fill her mouth. She waited. Tried. Waited again. Used the chisel wrapped in cloth to lift the ring without snapping it. The brass shifted with a tiny sound like a breath through teeth. Under the ring, the disc lifted 1/8 of an inch and stopped. There was old putty around its edge. Of course there was. The thought nearly made her laugh, not from humour but from recognition. Even a hidden thing in a Glassworks had been bedded against water by someone who knew weather. She ran the flexible putty knife around the disc slowly, cutting the seal in pieces. The putty had hardened near the top but remained gummy along the lower edge where damp had kept it alive. She worked for almost an hour, fingertips numb, knees aching, until the knife moved all the way around. When she lifted again, the disc came free. Beneath it was not a drain. It was a vertical shaft lined with brick and fitted with an iron crossbar about a foot below the opening. Resting on that crossbar was a flat stone, shaped to the circle, but with 2 finger holes bored through it. Tess stared down into the dark space beneath. Air rose from it, dry and cedar-scented beneath the damp of the room. Dry. That was the word that changed everything. She did not reach in at once. She stood, walked to the office, drank water, returned with the lantern Eli had added to her account 2 days before, when she admitted she had been using matches too freely. The lantern flame showed the stone clearly, no loose brick, no visible animals, no water pooled below. She hooked 2 fingers through the bored holes and lifted. The stone was heavier than she expected, but not impossible. It came up reluctantly, scraping once against the brick, then cleared the shaft. Beneath it lay a cavity longer than the circular opening, extending under the brick curb. Someone had built a hidden compartment behind the cleanout, sealed by disc, putty, stone, and the ordinary expectation that no one would care enough to clean a drainage trench in a condemned atelier. Inside were packages. Not one. Several. They had been wrapped first in oilcloth, then in a layer of heavy brown paper, then in clear plastic sheeting that looked newer than the rest, though yellowed and stiff. The outer wrapping had been tied with cotton cord gone dark with age. Tess touched the first bundle with the back of her fingers. Dry. Cool. Solid. She removed them slowly. The first package was long and narrow, nearly 3 feet, too heavy for paper alone. The second was a square tin box wrapped in cloth. The third was a flat portfolio sealed between 2 boards. The fourth was a smaller roll, stiff as a sleeping animal. Beneath them, at the rear of the compartment, lay a canvas pouch with a drawstring and a second tin, round and dented. She placed each on the central table after wiping the surface dry. The room seemed to lean inward. Tess did not tear anything. That mattered to her even before she understood why. She untied knots that could be untied, cut only where the cord had fused, folded each layer back and set it aside in order. Her hands had become very steady. Hunger, cold, fear and fatigue withdrew to the far walls for a while. The long package held tools. Not ordinary tools, though they were plain enough in appearance. A glass cutter with a brass barrel darkened by handling, a pair of grozing pliers wrapped in oiled cloth, a small lead knife with a curved blade and a walnut handle worn smooth at the thumb, 2 pattern shears, a glazing hammer, 3 custom bending forms in hardwood, shaped for narrow atrium ribs, a soldering iron with initials stamped near the copper head, CV. Tess touched the initials but did not claim them. The square tin held raw material sorted with a care that felt almost tender. Zinc clips, copper ties, hand-cut glazing points, folded strips of thin lead, small brass screws, and a packet of blackened nails wrapped in paper labelled for original curb only. Use no steel. The handwriting was angular, upright, and unknown to her. The flat portfolio held drawings. She opened it only far enough to see that the first sheet was a large plan of the atelier's main dome, drawn by hand in ink and watercolor wash. The ribs were numbered, the drainage channels were shown in blue, arrows marked summer sun, winter sun, vent position, heat rise, shaded work zone, and natural draft. Along the bottom margin someone had written, self-venting daylight roof, south-leaning curb intended to reduce lamp use by half. She opened the next sheet. A house with a deep central hall and a skylight designed not merely to admit brightness, but to move warm air upward in summer and hold low winter light along plaster walls. Another showed an atrium for a schoolroom, with operable vents and rain channels hidden inside decorative ribs. Another showed a greenhouse-roofed kitchen addition, captioned, "For coal savings in shoulder months." These were not decorative whims. They were practical acts of light. Tess folded the portfolio closed before damp air could do more than touch the edges. She set the bending forms on top to keep the boards flat. The smaller roll held cloth patterns, each labelled with measurements, some for curved glass sections, some for zinc cane, some for flashing cuts. The round tin held a military medal wrapped in a handkerchief, its ribbon faded but intact. Tess did not know enough to identify it at once, but the back bore the year 1945 and a name she read only once before wrapping it again. The name belonged to the building, not to her understanding yet. The canvas pouch made a sound when lifted. Coins? She loosened the drawstring and poured them into the enamel cup rather than onto the table, because old coins rolling toward cracks in the floor would have been a foolish loss. There were silver half-dollars, quarters, dimes, nickels dark with handling, wheat pennies, and 3 coins so worn that their faces had become more suggestion than image. Beneath the pouch, inside the second tin, lay paper money folded in groups and bound with cotton thread. Tess sat down. For a long time, she did not count. Money had not been abstract to her in years, if it ever had been. Money had been heat, shoes, bus fare, bread, a night indoors, the difference between asking and not asking. Money had been converted into other people's language, made to vanish under terms like fee, adjustment, necessity, obligation. She looked at the bound bills and felt not triumph, but caution so sharp it resembled pain. She counted because the building required facts. First, the coins. 2 Walking Liberty half-dollars, 11 Franklin half-dollars, 23 Washington quarters, most silver before 1965, 36 Mercury dimes, 42 Roosevelt silver dimes, 19 Buffalo nickels, a cloth twist of wheat pennies, 3 Indian head cents, 1 worn 1909 penny she set aside because the date felt too old to be tossed into arithmetic without respect. Then the bills. Singles, 5s, 10s, 20s, a few 50s, folded inside wax paper, some silver certificates with blue seals, some Federal Reserve notes, a $100 bill so old and formal-looking she nearly put it back without counting it, as if value could be too stiff to spend. She counted once and wrote the total. Then she counted again because fear had made mistakes before. $39,000, not more, not less. No odd cents in paper, but the coins added $7.84 by face value, though she knew some might be worth more, and none of them were merely face value now. She wrote it all down in the ledger page she had begun. Cash, $39,000. Coins face, $7.84. Tin medal, year 1945. Name unknown for now. Drawings, daylight roof systems, energy-saving notes, tools heirloom quality. Do not sell. Do not sell. She underlined that twice. The room had darkened while she counted. Rain returned softly, first as a whisper on the remaining panes, then as a patient tapping through the broken dome. Tess gathered the bills back into their cotton thread bundles, not taking a single one aside. She returned the coins to the pouch. She placed the medal in the tin, the tools in their cloth, the drawings between the boards, the patterns in their roll. Then she sat beside the table with all of it before her and let the lantern burn low. There was a letter. She found it beneath the portfolio, sealed in an envelope made from thick cream paper and wrapped in waxed cloth. Her name was not on it. No modern name was. Across the front, in the same angular hand as the material labels, someone had written, "To the one who opens the drain and does not mistake it for refuse." Tess held the envelope in both hands. The paper had survived because someone had understood water, because someone had known that roofs fail, families scatter, counties forget, and strangers may one day kneel in muck where descendants had not returned, because someone had hidden words behind a practical task, trusting that only a careful person would find them. She did not open it. Not that night. She wrapped the envelope again and set it beneath the tool cloth, then carried the lantern through the office and out the front door. The rain had thinned to mist once more. Evening lay low over the quarry spur. The walnut branches were bare and black against a sky moving toward winter. Water ran along the exterior drainage trench she had cleared, finding the slope, carrying silt in a narrow brown ribbon toward the old underground outlet. Tess stood in the wet grass and watched it move. The building behind her seemed altered, though nothing visible had changed. The roof was still broken, the stove still needed gasket rope, the floor still warned beneath careless steps. Hunger would come back, cold would come back. County deadlines would not soften because a hidden compartment had held money and drawings. Yet the place no longer felt merely unwanted. It had kept something, carefully, deliberately, through years when no one thanked it for keeping. Tess lifted her face to the mist until it cooled the soot still lodged near her hairline. She thought of Miriam's hand above hers, not touching, only ready. She thought of the clerk placing the $1 bill into an envelope. She thought of Eli writing pay when able in a ledger where her name looked steadier than she felt. Then she went back inside, closed the door, looped the chain, and placed the unopened letter beside the stove where it would stay dry until morning. The house had been waiting. Morning came without rain. That was the first mercy of it. Not sunlight, not warmth, not any sudden correction of the roof or the county's warnings, but a pause in the water, a held breath over the broken dome. Tess woke before the room had fully lightened, still wearing her coat, her cheek marked by the folded sleeve she had used as a pillow. The stove was cold. Ash sat behind the small iron door in the settled shape of last night's fire. The letter lay where she had left it, wrapped again in waxed cloth beside the stove, lifted slightly from the floor on 2 dry bricks. For several minutes she did not touch it. She moved first because work made fear less theatrical. She checked the buckets, carried one outside, emptied it into the ditch, and watched the water run along the trench without pooling where she had cleaned it. She brought in 2 armfuls of old wood, though only 4 pieces seemed dry enough to trust. She swept soot from around the stove, folded the plastic sheeting, and set the manual beneath a clamp to flatten its curled cover. Only after the room had been made orderly enough to receive the morning did she sit at the central table and unwrap the envelope. The handwriting stopped her. It was not Miriam's. She knew that at once. Miriam's hand had leaned forward, urgent even when writing grocery lists. This hand stood upright, narrow and exact, each letter spaced as if the writer believed paper deserved room to breathe. Yet there was something in it Tess recognized in her bones rather than her memory. The same respect for measurement, the same refusal to let a line drift merely because no one might inspect it. She turned the envelope over. The seal had cracked with age but had not failed. Someone had pressed plain wax over the flap and marked it with a small tool. Not a crest, only a circle crossed by 2 fine lines. A glazier's mark, perhaps, or a family habit that had outlived the family's ability to explain it. Tess slid the putty knife beneath the flap and opened it without tearing the paper. Inside were 6 sheets, folded twice along creases that had browned at the edges. She unfolded them slowly, smoothing each page with the flats of her fingers. The first line had been written in darker ink than the rest, as if the pen had paused there longer before moving on. My dear one, whoever you are, if you have found this letter, then you have done a piece of work no careless person would attempt. You have opened the south cleanout beneath the atrium trench, cut through the old putty, lifted the cedar disc, and had enough patience to wonder why a drain was dry. That tells me something about you, though I do not know your name. It tells me you did not arrive here merely hunting. You noticed. That is the beginning of all worthy I write from New Haven, in a rented room 3 blocks from the hospital, where Dr. Samuel B. Whitcomb has told me the growth in my chest will not be improved by hope or by stubbornness. He was careful in the saying of it. I appreciated that. I have known careless men and careful men, and I have found that the truth is easier to carry when handed over cleanly. I do not know whether I have months or less, so I am putting this record where water, lawyers, creditors, and foolish heirs are least likely to find it. My name is Clara Vale Calder. Born in 1892 in Deep River, Connecticut, daughter of Ruth Vale and Nathaniel Vale, granddaughter of Elias Vale, who came down from Worcester in 1868 with 2 glass cutters wrapped in wool and an account book tied with string. My husband was Thomas Alder Calder, born in 1889 near Haddam Neck, son of Peter Joseph Calder, a blacksmith's son who learned sash work after a hand injury kept him from heavy forge work. Before us came Ruth's mother, Alida Van Pelt Vale, born in 1841 in Kinderhook, New York, who painted borders for parlor transoms when women were not paid their worth but did the work exactly anyway. Before her was the name I can only write from family speech, Marta of Ghent, who crossed water with her brother in the 1830s and knew how to set small panes into lead so winter light could enter a room without inviting the weather in after it. This atelier was raised in stages. The front office was first, in 1891, brick from the Portland yards and stone from the old quarry road. The workroom followed in 1896, when the town still believed daylight was cheaper than lamps if a person knew how to guide it. The atrium dome was rebuilt in 1912 after the October gale took half the original glazing and taught my father that pride is a poor flashing compound. The trade did not end in one day, though people like to speak that way. It closed by inches. Coal grew dear, then cheap, then dear again. Sheet glass changed. Aluminum came in clean lengths from factories that could underbid a shop like ours. Houses were stripped of their old roofs and fitted with things made fast enough to forget. The exact day we locked the public door was November 14th, 1953, a Saturday. Rain from the northeast. I wrote the final receipt for a storm sash repair from a schoolhouse in East Hampton, swept the floor, wrapped the best tools, and turned the sign inward before supper. After that came more than 30 years of silence. I kept the roof patched as long as my knees would take the ladder. I answered letters from 3 old customers and refused 2 offers from men who wanted the brick but not the name. I came here on Mondays until the winter of 1986, when ice on the quarry road made walking foolish even for me. Silence has weight. Do not believe otherwise. It settles on benches, in drawers, across tools, and at last inside the mouth. We lost many, as most families do. My husband's brother, Daniel Calder, died in France in 1918 during the Meuse-Argonne fighting. My own son, Joseph Vale Calder, served with the 102nd Infantry in the last war and came home with his lungs ruined by cold and smoke. He lived until 1948 and never once complained where I could hear him. The medal in the tin belonged to Joseph. He said medals were only metal unless somebody remembered the cost without making speeches over it. If there is still a country that keeps cemeteries, take it there once, and let that be enough. If you intend to restore any part of this work, begin with water. Always water. Do not flatter glass until the roof can carry rain. For bedding flat panes into sash, warm the putty in your hand, never over direct flame, and mix whiting only until it takes the oil shine down to a satin face. Too dry, it cracks before Christmas. Too rich, it skins and sags by August. For the atrium curb, use copper where copper was used, zinc where zinc was used, and do not put plain steel against old work unless you wish to leave rust as your signature. When bending zinc came for a shallow radius, warm the shop to at least 55 degrees if you can. Below that, the metal argues. Score glass with 1 true pass, not 2. A second score is not correction. It is damage made official. Let fresh glazing cure 7 to 14 days before painting. Longer in damp weather. For linseed primer, thin the first coat until thirsty wood stops drinking. Give end grain twice the attention and half the pride. On leaded sections, solder quick and clean. Heat the joint, not your fear. If the iron smokes the flux black, you have waited too long. There are drawings with this letter because I believed daylight would matter again. I did not have the language fashionable men use now, but I knew a house with a proper skylight burns fewer lamps in the afternoon, warms differently in March, breathes more honestly in July, and gives sorrow fewer corners in which to gather. We made roofs that asked light to work. There is no shame in beauty that earns its keep. Do not mistake inheritance for money. Money is only one kind of stored effort, and it is often the first to be stolen, wasted, or praised beyond its character. A truer inheritance is a method, a caution, a line drawn by someone who hoped a stranger might one day understand it. I have hidden enough cash to keep demolition from being the first answer, but not enough to excuse foolishness. Spend slowly, account for every dollar. Let no man convince you that urgency is the same as wisdom. If you are kin, welcome. If you're not, welcome all the same. Blood is a narrow door when craft has always been a wider one. Keep what can be kept. Release what has already returned to earth. When you are tired, stop before you do harm. When you are proud, measure again. When you are lonely, sweep the bench and set the tools in order. The work will not embrace you, but it will stand beside you until you remember how to stand beside yourself. The house is not empty. It has been waiting. You're welcome here. Clara Vale Calder. Written this 3rd day of April, 1987. Tess read the letter once without moving. Then she read it again. The second time she noticed what the first reading had not allowed. The slight fading of ink near the bottom of the 4th page. The places where a word had been corrected by a precise line. The faint pressure marks from the sheet above. She noticed that Clara had written, "My dear one," without assuming who would deserve it. She noticed that the technical instructions were not separate from the tenderness. They were the tenderness, translated into ratios, temperatures, waiting periods, and warnings against pride. When she reached the final welcome again, Tess placed both hands flat on the table. The room remained the same. Broken dome. Wet boards. Cold stove. Soot at the hearth. Drawings wrapped beside her. Money sealed in its temporary order. Tools waiting in cloth. And yet the air had altered in a way no inspection report could have named. The building had been spoken for from inside its own silence. Tess folded the pages along their original creases. Not new creases, not easier ones. The old folds had held this long, and she honoured them by returning the paper to the shape it remembered. She slid the letter into its envelope, wrapped it again in waxed cloth, and tucked it between the boards of the portfolio where the drawings would keep it flat and dry. Only then did she stand. Her legs had gone stiff beneath the table. She walked once around the atrium, touching nothing, looking at the drainage trench, the cedar disc, the dark cavity now covered by stone, the brick curb, the ribs above. The letter had named the place, and in naming it, had given back its proportions. What had seemed like wreckage yesterday now appeared as work interrupted at a specific point in time, with reasons, hands, weather, and loss attached. There was a marker mentioned nowhere in the county file. Clara had written of the South cleanout, the quarry road, and the family, but near the bottom of the last page in a postscript Tess had nearly missed, she had added, "If the walnut behind the rear door still stands, look for the horseshoe. Thomas placed it high enough to make me scold him, and low enough for time to bring it down." Tess unbarred the rear door. The plank lifted from its brackets reluctantly, scattering dust and a dead beetle onto the floor. The door itself stuck at the bottom, then gave with a damp scrape. Cold air entered, clean after the cellar smell of the building. Behind the atelier, the ground sloped toward a shallow run of water that fed the marsh culvert farther down. The walnut tree stood 20 steps from the back wall, wider than any of the trees along the road, its bark dark and deeply ridged, its crown bare against the pale morning. At first she saw nothing. Then she walked around the trunk and found the horseshoe. It had been nailed to the south side long ago, now half swallowed by the growing bark. Iron showed in a crescent, rusted but visible, the curve pressed into the tree as if the walnut had been closing its hand around it for decades. One nail remained exposed, the others had disappeared into wood. Beneath it, someone had once carved the same small mark as the seal, a circle crossed by two fine lines. Moss filled the grooves, green and patient. Tess stood before it with her arms at her sides. The walnut had grown. The building had failed. People had died. Papers had vanished. Money had been hidden, lost, found. Yet the iron stayed where Thomas had placed it, and Clara's note had crossed the years with enough accuracy to put Tess's hand on the bark. She did not pray. She pressed her palm to the tree and let the roughness mark her skin. Back inside, the light had shifted. Clouds thinned over the broken dome, and a clean white brightness entered the workroom, laying itself across the central table where the letter had been opened. Tess remembered then the other object in the long package, wrapped separately at the bottom beneath the tools. She unwrapped it. It was a candle, thick and hand-dipped, the colour of old cream, stored in waxed paper and tied with thread. A small note around it read, "Beeswax from Lydia Barlow's hives, summer 1962. For the first safe night after reopening, or for grief. Use wisely." The wick had darkened with age but remained intact. Tess set the candle in a shallow iron holder found on the shelf near the chimney. The stove was cold, but one ember had survived beneath ash, dull red when she opened the door and stirred gently with the poker. She fed it a curl of paper, then a sliver of dry wood, waiting until flame became flame, and not only memory of flame from that. She lit the candle. The beeswax took slowly, first a blue tremor, then a yellow point, then a small steady light that did not flicker as wildly as the match had. It released a faint honeyed scent into the office, not sweet enough to cover damp, only enough to stand beside it. The candle light touched the brass cutter, the portfolio boards, the enamel cup, the ledgers she had begun in pencil, the stove blackening her sleeve at the cuff. For the first time since entering, the room held a light that did not come from weather, flashlight, county office, or borrowed battery. It came from something kept for grief, or for a safe night. Tess did not know which one this was, and perhaps careful things could serve both. She sat on the floor near the stove and warmed the last of the cornmeal into a plain mush with water, stirring until lumps softened against the spoon. While it thickened, her mind followed not the money, not the repair orders, not the demolition schedule, but the small chain of hands that had kept her from falling beyond reach. The bus driver who had waited 3 extra seconds while she fumbled coins from a wet pocket. The farmhand near Colchester who had pointed toward the hay barn and pretended not to see her shame. The woman in the church basement who had pressed the extra roll into the napkin without turning charity into a performance. Margaret Dunleavy, who had tucked a copied drainage plan beneath the deed and an apple into a brown paper bag. Eli Harkness, who had written her name into a ledger and given her a manual no one could sell. None of them had rescued her in the grand manner people like to put in stories after the danger has passed. They had not solved her life. They had not made speeches. They had each moved one small thing from impossible toward possible, and then stepped back without demanding ownership of the result. That was how a person crossed a river when there was no bridge, stone by stone. And you listening now, perhaps you know the shape of such a kindness. Not the grand one that changes everything at once, but the modest one that arrived when your hands were full, when pride had already worn thin, when a stranger held a door, paid a fare, left a meal, spoke your name correctly, or believed your yes before the world had finished saying no. If you have carried one of those mercies for years, write it down somewhere before the day ends. Tell it in the comments if you wish, or keep it folded in your own quiet drawer. These stories travel because people remember the hands that did not have to help and did. Tess ate the cornmeal while the candle burned. It was not enough food, but it was warm. She washed the cup with a little water and dried it with the old cotton rag from her vest, then stopped when she realized what she had done. Miriam's rag, used at last, not as a relic but as a tool. The stain it lifted from the cup left a faint brown mark in the cloth. Tess rubbed the edge between her fingers and then folded it clean side out. The day passed in tasks made smaller by the letter's company. She did not touch the cash except to wrap it more safely. She lined the bottom of an empty drawer with plastic, placed the bundles inside a tin, and wrote only drawing weights on a scrap taped to the front. The coins she returned to the canvas pouch. The medal stayed in its handkerchief, moved gently to the shelf above the stove where damp would not reach it. The tools she cleaned with a dry rag and a little oil, no more than necessary, setting each in a row on the table as Miriam had done on Saturdays long ago. Glass cutter, grozing pliers, lead knife, pattern shears, glazing hammer, bending forms. She wrote their names in the ledger, then the names from the letter, copying them slowly so each person entered the room, again, with the dignity of being spelled correctly. Clara Vale Calder, Ruth Vale, Nathaniel Vale, Elias Vale, Alida van Pelt Vale, Martha of Ghent, Thomas Alder Calder, Daniel Calder, Joseph Vale Calder. At Joseph's name, she paused. The medal remained wrapped. She would learn properly before doing anything foolish with honour she had not earned. For now, it was enough that the tin no longer sat in a hidden cavity where no living person could speak the name beside it. In the afternoon she walked to the walnut again with the ledger tucked under her coat and sketched the horseshoe, the carved mark, and the way the bark had grown around iron. Her fingers stiffened in the cold. Twice she had to warm them under her arms before continuing. The drawing was not beautiful, but it was exact enough. She labelled the south side, the distance from the back door, the height from ground to horseshoe, the visible nail, the mark beneath, memory kneeling on paper. As she returned to the atelier, she noticed something she had missed the day before. The rear wall had a stone set into the foundation near the door, different from the others, smoother and pale. She knelt and brushed mud from it, no inscription, only a tool mark, the same circle and cross, almost worn away. Tess copied that too. The building had been signed in places weather could not easily erase. Evening arrived without rain, and with it came cold. She made a careful fire, small enough for the uncertain chimney, large enough to warm the office if she sat near. The beeswax candle had burned down by a third, so she pinched it out with damp fingers and saved the rest. Use wisely, the note had said. The room kept the honey scent after the flame died, faint but stubborn. Before sleeping, Tess arranged the heirlooms beside her, not like treasure, but like witnesses. The letter went under the portfolio boards, wrapped and lifted from the floor. The glass cutter lay in its cloth roll near her right hand. The metal tin rested on the shelf above the stove. The cotton rag dried over the counter edge. The ledger, pencil, and county map lay beneath the enamel cup so no draught would move them. She stretched out on the plywood behind the counter, her coat pulled tight, boots still on because the floor had not earned that much trust yet. Firelight moved against the ceiling in dull orange patches. Beyond the office wall, the atrium opened to the sky, and through the torn plastic and broken ribs she could see one early star, steady in the cold. No one had come. No one had taken back the deed. No one had explained the welcome away. Tess closed her eyes with the sound of the stove settling. The letter's words folded inside the room, and the tools of the dead laid close enough that, if she woke in darkness, she could reach out and touch the proof that something careful had survived. On December 3rd, the first snow came before daylight, laying 4 inches across the quarry spur and turning every broken pane in the atrium into a white-edged wound. Tess woke because the sound had changed. Rain announced itself in strikes and beads and small collisions, but snow made no such argument. It quieted the building from above. It gathered on the torn plastic, softened the piles of brick dust near the doors, and drifted through the open places in the dome, landing on the central work table in a clean powder that did not yet understand the ruin beneath it. She stood under the office lintel and watched the workroom pale. Snow had entered in 5 visible places, maybe 6. The largest opening in the atrium dome had received it openly, of course, but the more urgent failures were over the front office, where the missing slate near the ridge had allowed meltwater to find the ceiling and darken a long seam above the counter. Winter had removed the luxury of waiting. Water could be caught in a bucket. Snow became weight. That morning, she took Eli's roofing chapter from the manual and read it 3 times beside the stove. Once to learn the names. Decking, underlayment, drip edge, course, exposure, ridge, valley, flashing, starter strip. She wrote them on the back of a grocery sack and drew the roof as if the act of drawing could make the rafters less tired. Once to doubt herself. The book warned against roof work in freezing weather, against working alone, against ladders on frozen ground, against walking near rotten decking, against trusting surface appearance. It said a roof could fail politely until the moment it did not. Tess copied the warning in the ledger because fear became less wild when written plainly, once to find what she had missed. The front office roof was not the atrium dome that mattered. The dome would need more than one pair of hands, more than money, more than December light. But the modest pitched roof over the front office could be kept from worsening if she worked from the ladder, from planks set across sound rafters and from the edge inward. The manual showed patching, sistering short rafter sections, laying felt, replacing slates or shingles, and sealing flashing enough to last through a season. At Harkness on Sun, she spread her measurements on the counter. Eli leaned over them without praise. You measured outside wall to outside wall. Yes, sir. And slope. I used a string and the level from your shelf. Borrowed. Yes, sir. Borrowed. He checked her numbers with the carpenter's pencil. The roof over the office was 22 feet long and 14 feet from eave to ridge on each side, with a narrow overhang that had rotted badly along the north edge. The old slate could not be fully matched and did not need to be, not yet. She would patch the missing and worst sections with architectural asphalt shingles from a discontinued bundle, cover the exposed decking with 15-pound felt, replace 2 damaged boards, and sister one rafter tail where water had eaten the end. Ellie made her calculate the materials aloud. 3 bundles would do the whole side if you were making it handsome, he said. You are not making it handsome. No, sir. You're making it shed water. Yes, sir. Then 1 bundle, carefully placed, half roll of felt. Roofing nails, Galvanized cap nails for the felt if we have them loose. You do not have cap nails loose. So we make do with tin discs punched from scrap. He wrote the prices in the ledger: discontinued shingles, $7 for the open bundle, half roll of 15-pound felt, $4 roofing nails, $1.40, 2 8-foot boards from the coal rack, $3 tar paper cement from a dented can, $1, a second coil of clothesline, because roof work had a way of inventing needs, 80 cents. Then he went to the back room and returned carrying a roofing hatchet with a leather-wrapped handle, the head dark from use. This was my father's, he said. Tess stepped back before she meant to. I cannot take that. You are not taking it. You are using it. The distinction settled between them. The hatchet had a gauge notch near the blade and a hammer face polished bright on one edge. The leather was cracked where a thumb had rested for years. Ellie placed it on the counter, not gently, but with a certain finality. You will bring it back when the front roof no longer leaks? Yes, sir. And you will not swing it angry? No, sir. Good. Tools dislike drama. She carried the materials back in 2 trips through snow that had turned wet by noon. The bundle of shingles made her shoulders burn. The felt roll banged against her knee. 3 times she stopped beneath walnut branches, breathing into her scarf, counting not from weakness but to keep the next step exact. The skilled elder arrived the following morning without invitation. Tess was setting the ladder against the front wall when a man in a navy watch cap came up the quarry spur, carrying his own hammer and a thermos. He was lean in the old way, all rope and tendon under a brown canvas coat. His beard was white and short. One eye watered constantly in the cold, which he dabbed with a folded handkerchief between movements. Name is August Bell, he said. Eli says you're about to get yourself killed slowly. Tess held the ladder with both hands. I was going to work from the edge. That is one way to begin. He looked at the roof for a long minute. Not at her. Not at the building in general. At the roof. His gaze moved from ridge to eave, chimney side to north rot, missing slate to sagging fascia. I roofed 42 years, he said. I do not climb high anymore. I do not take pay. I will stand where I can stand and tell you when you are wrong. I can pay later, Tess said. No, I can at least. No. The word was not rude. It was a board nailed across a door. For 11 days, August Bell came when weather allowed and stood in the gravel, on the ladder's lower rungs, or inside the office looking up at the ceiling stains while Tess worked above him. He taught in short sentences, most of them unpleasantly useful. 3 points touching. Do not reach. That board lies. Weight overrung. Chalk line first. That nail's proud. Pull it. She pulled it. The first work was not shingling but trust-making. She tested the ladder feet, dug them into gravel, tied the top rail to an iron bracket beside the canopy, and marked the unsafe overhang with chalk from below. August made her press each roof board with the handle of the hammer before kneeling near it. 2 boards sounded thin. One gave slightly beneath pressure. She removed those by working from the side, prying nails slowly so rotten wood did not split under her hands. The sister rafter was a lesson in humility. The original rafter tail had softened where the gutter once leaked. She cut back only what August told her to cut, then held the new board alongside the old, matching the angle with a bevel gauge borrowed from Eli. They fastened it with carriage bolts Eli had found in a coffee can, drilling pilot holes by hand because electricity remained a rumour. August watched the alignment from below. Not proud. Tess adjusted. Not shy. She adjusted again. Now, the chalk line came next. August snapped it himself the first time, showing her how to pull the string tight enough that it sang, but not so hard that it wandered. The blue mark leapt across the felt like a decision. Tess laid the first course by that line, knees aching through her trousers, gloves stiff with cold. The roofing nails required a rhythm she did not have at first. Tap to set, drive, finish. August called it the three-stroke nail. A wild arm bent nails and bruised shingles. A fearful arm left heads standing. A correct arm let the hammer fall through the wrist, not the shoulder. That nail's proud. Pull it. By the fourth day. She heard the difference herself. A seated nail made a certain sound against roof and wood, final but not crushed. She began to love that sound, though love was not a word she used aloud for anything so temporary as winter roofing. Snow came twice during the work, once only a dusting, once another 3 inches that delayed them a day, and forced Tess to sweep the roof before returning to the felt. Her hands split at 2 knuckles, the work gloves wore through at the thumb. She ate beans, apples and cornmeal, then beans again, because roof money had eaten food money and the building could not digest excuses. On the 9th day, August let her set the final shingles near the north eave without correction for a full hour. She knew better than to look at him for approval. She trimmed the edge, tucked the felt properly, pressed cement beneath the lifted seam, and set tin-disked nails where the wind would most likely search for weakness. On December 14th, the front office roof stopped dripping. Not permanently. Not handsomely, but honestly enough. That evening, meltwater ran down the patched slope and fell from the eave instead of entering the ceiling. Tess stood inside the office beneath the seam that had darkened after the first snow, and watched it remain merely stained. August stood beside the door, drinking coffee from his thermos. "It will hold the season," he said. That was all. But he stayed until the stove took draught, and before leaving, he tapped the borrowed roofing hatchet against the doorframe once, as if sealing the work with the sound of the tool that had done it. January hardened the building by degrees. The snow in the shaded trench became grey ice, and the walnut branches clicked together at night like tools being sorted in a drawer. The stove had become the centre of Tess's days, but the chimney remained an uncertain mercy. It drew, yes, it carried smoke upward, but after 2 weeks of small fires, flakes of brick began appearing on the hearth tiles, and when Tess brushed the chimney breast with her fingertips, mortar powdered away in pale grains. Spalling. The manual had a photograph of it, brick faces breaking under trapped moisture and freeze-thaw, mortar joints losing their grip, fire and weather negotiating badly inside a wall. The chimney's lean had not worsened, but the lower courses near the thimble were tired. The exterior stack would need warmer weather and better staging. The interior repairs could not wait. Eli came out once to look. He removed his cap indoors, though the room was colder than the store. He pressed a screwdriver gently into 3 mortar joints, watched the material crumble, and made a sound in his throat that was neither alarm nor comfort. "Do not burn hot," he said. "I haven't. I know. Keep not doing it." He scraped a sample of the old mortar into his palm. Soft lime. Not Portland cement. You pack modern cement into this. Brick loses the argument. Back at the hardware store, he measured from 3 bins and 1 old paper sack that had belonged to his father's stock, hydraulic lime, fine sand, fireclay, a small amount of Portland only where heat was low and structural patching required it, which Eli discouraged with a stare before Tess could ask. For the joints near the firepath, he recommended a lime and fireclay blend, 3 parts sharp sand, 1 part hydraulic lime, 1/2 part fireclay by volume, mixed dry first, then wetted slowly until it held its shape without shining. "Like brown sugar for a crust," he said. "I have not made many pies." Then like creek mud that has dignity. She understood that better. The chimney work lasted 3 weeks because mortar had its own calendar. Tess built only brief morning fires, let the brick warm slightly, then let it cool before working. She chiselled failing joints by hand, never more than 3/4 of an inch deep where the brick remained sound, deeper only where the old mortar had already surrendered. The cold chisel rang softly in the office. Tap, scrape, brush. Tap, scrape, brush. She cleaned the dust from each joint with the hand broom and a narrow paintbrush Eli had given her from a box of unsellable odds. The temperature stayed in the 20s most days. Inside, beside the stove, water formed skin in the enamel cup if she left it too far from embers. Tess mixed mortar in small batches because cold punished haste. Too much water and the mix slumped from the joint. Too little and it would not bond. She learned to mist the old brick first, using a bottle with a cracked sprayer from the washroom cabinet, because dry brick stole water from new mortar like a thirsty mouth. Every 15 minutes, her bare fingers went numb. Gloves were too clumsy for the tight pointing near the thimble. She wore them to mix, removed them to press and shape, then put her hands beneath her arms until the sting of returning blood made her eyes close. She did not curse. Words spent that way did not warm anything. She only waited until feeling returned enough to continue. The pointing tool was not proper. Eli had no spare narrow jointer, so August Bell filed the handle of a broken spoon into a rounded edge and left it on the counter one morning without explanation. It worked. Tess packed mortar into each cleaned joint with the tip of the putty knife, then struck it smooth with the spoon handle, concave and slightly recessed, matching the old work where it remained visible. The chimney taught her a slower patience than the roof. The roof was movement, balance, weather, decision. The chimney was repetition nearly too modest to narrate. Clear a joint, brush dust, mist brick, press mortar, strike line, clean smear, wait. Return the next day and see where the work had shrunk, where a small gap appeared, where pride had made a joint too full and the brick face had been stained. On the coldest morning, January 18th, she woke to 12 degrees and did not work until noon. Even then the office never rose above freezing except near the stove. She sat on the floor wrapped in her coat, holding the old glass cutter in her palm, turning it end over end while her breath showed in the air. The cutter was not for chimney work. It had nothing to do with brick, yet its weight reminded her that tools could wait without reproach. She could too. The final patch near the thimble took 2 attempts. The first mix was too wet, and when she pressed it into the joint, it sagged in a slow, humiliating curve. Tess scraped it out before it set, cleaned the brick again, and sat back on her heels while the office darkened toward afternoon. Too rich, she said aloud, because naming failure made it less likely to return in costume. The second mix held. By late January, the repaired joints had cured enough for a test fire. Not a hot one. Eli had been exact. A handful of shavings, then 3 thin splits, then waiting with the stove door cracked while draught took. Smoke rose. The thimble joint remained clean. No dark seepage marked the fresh mortar. No smell of smoke entered the office beyond the honest smell of the firebox when opened. Outside, Tess stood in the snow and looked up. A pale thread of smoke rose from the chimney and moved east in the cold air. It did not billow from cracks. It did not roll down the brick. It went clean. She watched until it thinned into the sky. The floors asked for attention only after the roof and chimney stopped demanding fear. The front office boards were white pine, hand-planned in long planks of uneven width, some 12 inches across, some narrower, all fastened with hand-cut rose-head nails that caught the light when grime was cleared from around them. Near the counter, foot traffic had worn shallow paths into the wood. Near the north window, water had raised grain until the surface felt like old rope beneath Tess's palm. The northeast corner remained suspect and would not be repaired until spring. But the central office floor where she slept and wrote could be made clean enough for living. She did not intend beauty. Beauty came later, if at all. What she needed was a surface that did not hold mildew, splinters, soot, mouse leavings, and 70 years of dust in every seam. She swept first, then scrubbed with hot water in small areas using rags, a stiff brush, and a little vinegar from the cafe owner, Doris, who had begun wrapping day-old bread in paper and pretending it was waste she needed removed. The scrubbing revealed colour unevenly. Dark honey near the protected places beneath the counter. Grey-brown where water had entered. Almost black near the stove. Beneath the dirt, the pine had not died. It had only been covered by years. Ellie rented her a random orbit sander for $14 a day and made her sign the rental tag, though her account already carried more than she liked to see. He included 3 sets of sanding discs, 80,
120,
and 220 grit. Do not begin with rage, he said. 80 is not a punishment. It is a question. The sander ran from a borrowed generator because the building still had no electricity. Eli brought the generator himself in the back of his truck and set it outside, far from the doors, explaining carbon monoxide without dressing the warning in drama. The cord entered through a cracked office window padded with rags. The machine's noise filled the building so completely that Tess could not hear the usual drips, creaks, or branch taps. For the first time, the atelier sounded not abandoned but worked. She wore the dust mask and tied her hair in a rag. The first pass, 80 grit, was slow and cautious. She let the sander move in overlapping paths with the grain, never staying long in one place, never trying to erase every scar. The manual and Eli agreed on that. Old flaws could be cleaned. They did not need to be made into lies. Rosehead nails had to be set below the sanding path, so she went ahead with a nail set and hammer, tapping each proud head down only as far as needed. The 80 grit pass took most of one day and all her shoulders. The second pass, 120, brought the floor into a different kind of honesty. Scratches softened, grey loosened. The pale and dark places began to speak to one another instead of arguing across the room. Dust gathered in the corners like flour. Tess vacuumed with Eli's old shop vac until the motor smelled hot, then wiped boards with a tack cloth made from cheesecloth and a whisper of linseed oil. The third pass, 220, was nearly tender. By then her hands vibrated even after the machine stopped. Her wrists felt hollow. She sat often, not from laziness, but because a tired hand could gouge in 3 seconds what patience had saved in 3 days. The 220 did not change the floor dramatically, it refined the light on it. When she ran her palm over the boards afterward, the pine felt like wood again instead of history's rough draft. For finish, Eli argued with himself aloud for 10 minutes and settled on a simple blend. Tung oil where water resistance mattered near the stove path, boiled linseed oil thinned for the first coat across the rest, then 2 additional coats in careful intervals, no polyurethane. The boards needed to breathe. The building had been suffocated long enough. The first coat drank unevenly. End grain darkened at once. Dry boards took oil and asked for more. Water-stained places resisted, then surrendered slowly. Tess worked on her knees with a folded rag, pressing oil thinly, wiping excess, returning after 30 minutes to catch any shining places before they became sticky. The room smelled of nut, seed, cold air, and old pine waking underhand. 48 hours of cure between coats. That was what the label said. Eli confirmed it. August added that labels were often optimistic and weather was not literate. Tess waited the full time and more when the office stayed cold. She kept the stove low, ventilated when she could, and slept in the workroom doorway for 2 nights so the floor could rest without boot marks. After the second coat, the wood shifted from dark honey towards something deeper. After the third, the protected places glowed mahogany in the lamplight, though the pine remained pine and did not pretend to be grander wood. The rosehead nails showed as small dark constellations. Water scars remained near the window. A burn mark near the stove stayed visible. Tess was glad of that. A floor without memory would not have suited the room. Then came the bad morning. It was January 29th, and nothing particular had happened to earn it. The stove drafted. The roof shed meltwater. The floor cure was complete enough to walk carefully. She had bread from Doris, beans from Eli's dented shelf, and a ledger full of progress any sensible person would consider encouraging. Still, she woke with her body heavy in a way sleep did not repair. Her hands ached before she used them. The air felt too close. The list on the wall looked less like guidance than accusation. Patch north sill. Inventory rear lean-to. Price chimney cap. Clear atrium glass. Wright County. Pay Eli. Eat. Boil water. Sweep. Measure. Do not waste. Do not fail. She tried to stand and sat back down. For a long while, she watched the stove door without lighting it. The cold entered. She allowed it. Then she put on her coat, took the stale heel of bread from the counter, and walked out to the marsh beyond the culvert. The marsh had frozen along its edges, but open water moved darkly near the centre where the creek fed through. Brown reeds stood stiff above snow, their seed heads trembling in a wind too light to feel on skin. Tess sat on a flat stone near the bank and ate the bread without tasting it. A great blue heron stood in the shallows. She had not expected one in that weather. It looked almost made of the same cold as the morning. Long-legged, patient, blue-grey against brown reeds and pewter water. It did not fish. It did not fly. It stood with the exact dignity of a creature that owed no explanation for stillness. Tess sat there until her feet went numb. She did no work that day. When she returned near dusk, the building had not collapsed from her absence. The floor waited with its dark honey boards. The stove waited with its ash. The ledger waited with its blank next line. She lit the fire, warmed water, and wrote only one sentence before sleeping. Rest is not abandonment. By February, the windows had become the next honest enemy. There were 8 in the front and side rooms, not counting the broken atrium panes above. 3 had no glass at all, only boards nailed from inside years earlier, and seams where wind entered with a knife edge. 4 were cracked badly enough that rain could travel along the fractures and drip from the lower muntins. 1 window, the narrow south-facing sash beside the office counter, remained original. Tess knew it before Eli confirmed it. The glass was wavy, faintly green at the edge, with tiny bubbles caught inside, as if the pane had held its breath since another century. The muntins were slimmer than the replacements. The rosehead nails around the frame had been set by hand. On the inner rail, nearly hidden beneath paint, someone had scratched 1788 into the wood, which meant the sash had been salvaged from a structure older than the atelier and given a second life there. "Do not replace that," Eli said. "I was not going to." "Good." He leaned close, looking through the old pane toward the walnut. People throw away what they cannot date. Then they buy poor imitations and call themselves respectful. The other 7 windows required triage. For the empty 3, Tess used salvaged flat panes from the workroom racks, measuring twice and cutting once, only after practicing on cracked waste glass. The old brass cutter from the cache rested in her hand, with a different balance than the cheap cutter Eli had first lent her. She did not use the heirloom on rough practice. That felt wrong. But after 2 successful cuts with the borrowed cutter, she cleaned the brass one, oiled the wheel lightly, and let it make the first true score on a replacement pane for the north office window. The sound nearly stopped her. Quiet, exact. A single hiss across glass. She set the score over a dowel. Pressed evenly, and the pane broke clean along the line. Not perfectly, but clean enough. She stood with the 2 pieces before her, thinking of Miriam, then of Clara, then of all the hands that had known the pressure between too little and too much. For bedding compound, Eli sold her a partial tub of DAP 33 glazing putty with a cracked lid, still workable beneath the skin. He made her knead it until it softened, dusting her fingers with whiting when it grew sticky. The technique was not complicated in description and unforgiving in practice. Scrape old glazing, pull failed points, clean rabbit, prime bare wood with thinned linseed oil, lay a thin bed of putty, press glass gently, never at the centre, set glazier points with putty knife, spaced close enough to hold but not so close they announced panic, roll putty into a rope, press along the exterior edge, Draw the knife in one deliberate angle, leaving a bevel that shed water instead of inviting it. Her first bevel was ashamed of itself, too wavy near the bottom, too thin at the corner, heavy along the left muntin. Tess scraped it out before it skinned and did it again. The second attempt held a cleaner line. The third, on the east window, began to resemble something a craftsperson might leave overnight without apology. The cracked 4 required gentler work. 2 panes could be replaced from salvage. 1 had to be temporarily bridged with clear tape and exterior storm plastic because the crack ran through a curved piece she could not yet cut. 1 lower pane shattered when she tried to remove old points from a sash swollen by damp. The sound made her flinch backwards so hard she struck her elbow against the counter. She stood still until the last sliver settled. Then she swept every piece, brushed the sill with a damp rag, and wrote in the ledger, "Glass punishes haste even when haste is fear." The sash cords came next because the west office window would not stay open, and a window that falls is only a guillotine with manners. Eli had cotton sash cord, Vone 1/4 inch, sold by the foot from a spool older than his cash register. He showed her the figure-8 knot at the counterweight, making it twice with his own thick fingers, then cutting it apart so she could make it herself. Again, he said. She tied it. Again, she tied it. Now do it cold. He opened the back door of the store and made her stand in the winter air for 2 minutes before tying the knot again. She understood the lesson when her fingers stiffened and the cord no longer behaved like a drawing. At the atelier, the weight pocket opened after she scored the painted seam and pried with the putty knife. Inside, dust fell first, then a cast-iron counterweight dark with age. The old cord had rotted to threads. Tess threaded the new cord over the pulley, tied the figure-8 knot at the weight, tested the travel, then attached the other end to the sash with 2 screws set into old holes and 1 new pilot hole where the wood had split. The window rose. More importantly, it stayed. She lowered it, raised it, lowered it again. The pulley made a dry whisper that would need oil, but the sash moved in its track with the reserved grace of something remembering its office. The original 1788 sash received only cleaning and protection. Tess removed loose paint from the frame, not down to newness, only down to what would no longer flake. She brushed the old glass with barely damp cloth, supporting it with her other hand. The bubbles in the pane distorted the walnut branches outside, bending them into a softer world. She did not polish away every trace. Some clouding belonged to age, and age had earned the right not to be made invisible. The final window was the small one near the storage alcove, its lower pane missing, upper pane cracked, sash cord gone, putty failed on 3 sides. Tess had delayed it because the corner was awkward, and the floor below had 1 board she still did not trust. She laid a plank across 2 joists, tested it with the hammer handle, then knelt with her tools arranged in order. Outside snow had melted from the south side of the walnut, leaving dark leaves pressed flat against the ground. The afternoon light came weak and low. Tess cut the replacement pane on the central table, carried it with both hands, set it into the putty bed, and pressed along the edges rather than the center points. Putty rope, knife angle, corner tuck, clean bevel, as she drew the last line of putty along the bottom rail. A chickadee landed on the walnut branch just beyond the glass. It was so close she could see the tiny claws around the twig, the black cap, the quick turn of its head. The bird looked into the room, or seemed to. It gave no song, only 1 small flicker of presence against the winter branch. Tess held the putty knife still. For a moment the office, the window, the tree, the bird and her own hand formed one exact arrangement, inside and outside, meeting at a pane she had cut, bedded, pointed and sealed. Cold remained, repairs remained, debt remained. The dome still stood broken over the workroom, and spring was not yet close enough to trust, but light came through the glass. The house had been waiting. She finished the bevel after the bird flew. Late February entered through the walls before it entered through the calendar. The roof still shed water, the chimney drew clean enough for modest fires, the floors held their new dark sheen, and the windows had stopped the wind from crossing the office as if it owned the place. Only then did the plaster begin to tell the truth. It had survived longer than Tess expected. Horsehair plaster on hand-split oak lath, original in broad sections though patched in places by later hands that had used whatever was cheapest and nearest. Along the east wall the plaster still held firm when tapped with knuckles. Near the counter it rang dull but not hollow. Around the chimney, however, 3 patches had failed so completely that they seemed to be hanging by memory alone. The first was above the thimble where heat and damp had made a crescent crack. The second lay beside the chimney breast, bulging outward like bread left too long to rise. The third had already fallen behind the stove in palm-sized pieces, exposing the old lath beneath. The lath was oak, split by hand, not sawn, each strip irregular and sturdy, nailed with small dark cut nails into the studs. Between the strips, old plaster keys had squeezed through and hardened like fingers gripping from behind. Tess touched one with the tip of a pencil. It held. That gave her the rule for the job. Save every key still sound. Remove only failure. Do not enlarge the wound for the pleasure of making a cleaner rectangle. Ellie had a paper bag of horsehair in the loft above the hardware store, wrapped in newspaper from the 1950s and smelling faintly of dust, lime, and some animal memory too old to be unpleasant. He brought it down carefully and set it on the counter, as if it might object to sunlight. "My father bought this for a farmhouse job," he said. Man changed his mind and covered the room in panelling. Tess looked at the bag. "It is still good?" Hair keeps better than opinions. The plaster mix required restraint. Lime putty, sharp sand, chopped horsehair, and water added slowly, always slowly. Ellie gave her the ratios in a careful voice. 2.5 parts sand to 1 part lime for the base. Enough hair to bind without clumping. No cement in the old wall, not unless she wanted the patch to behave like a stone in bread. For the finish, finer sand and a thinner coat, worked only after the brown coat had cured. 3 coats. Scratch. Brown. Finish. The scratch coat went in first, pressed through the lath spaces so new keys formed behind the wall. Tess mixed small batches in the dented bucket with a scrap of board, folding hair through the lime until the strands disappeared into the mass. The plaster had a living resistance under the trowel, neither mud nor mortar, something more fibrous, more willing to hold a shape if treated honestly. She dampened the lath with a brush, then pressed the first coat in with the flat of the trowel. It squeezed between strips and caught. She scored the surface afterward with the edge of a notched scrap, making diagonal lines for the next coat to grip. The wall looked wounded and mended at once. The brown coat came after the scratch had firmed but not turned hard and proud. 3/8 of an inch, Eli had said, close enough to level the plane, not so thick that drying would crack it from within. Tess used 2 narrow wooden screeds to guide the thickness, drawing the trowel upward in patient strokes. She left it rougher than the finish would need, then waited 72 hours because lime did not care for a lonely person's impatience. During the waiting she did other work that made no good scene for any story. She carried ash outside, she boiled water, she wrote Eli's account payments in the ledger, she cut more plastic to cover the atrium table when wet weather returned, she scraped paint from the least damaged window casing. She slept heavily and woke with plaster dust in her hair. The finish coat was only 1/8 inch, thin enough that pride could ruin it. She mixed it smoother with finer sand, then worked it over the cured brown coat in long strokes, feathering the edges into the old wall. The seam did not disappear entirely. That was all right. A repair that pretended not to be a repair would have been a vanity the building had not asked for. When the final surface had set to a soft mat, Tess stood by the stove, rubbing dried lime from the heel of her hand. "These patches will hold another 100 years," she said. The words surprised her because they had come out with the shape of belief, not hope. No one answered, but the wall held. Doris Shaw owned the cafe at the corner where the town still looked like town and not yet like road. It was called the River Spoon, painted in fading blue over a door that stuck in damp weather. Doris was a widow in her late 50s with strong forearms, a soft middle, and black hair pinned high with 2 pencils she could find without looking. She wore white aprons over flowered dresses and could carry 4 plates along one arm while telling a supplier, a customer, and a town councilman the separate truths each deserved. Tess first entered the cafe because the cold had driven her farther than pride could follow. She ordered the cheapest tea on the board and sat near the window, holding the cup until it cooled too much to be worth holding. Doris refilled it without being asked. When Tess reached for coins, Doris shook her head and wiped the counter with unnecessary vigour. Refills are weather-related, that was all she said. A week later, paper bags began appearing on the atelier doorstep before dawn. The first held 2-day-old rolls, an apple with 1 bruised side, and a folded square of wax paper containing butter. The second held soup in a jar, wrapped in a dish towel. The third held a heel of ham, 3 biscuits, and a note written on order pad paper. Return jar. Keep towel until spring. Tess walked into the cafe that afternoon with the clean jar and towel folded over her arm. "I need to pay you," she said. Doris was cutting pie behind the counter. She did not stop cutting. "No, I can put it on an account. No, I am already in debt at Harkness. Then do not build a second monument to owing." Tess stood with the towel in both hands. Doris slid a slice of apple pie onto a plate and set it in the window for a customer. "You can pay me in candles when the shop reopens." "The shop is not close to reopening." "I did not say tomorrow. I do not make candles." "You lit one." "I heard." Tess looked up. Doris shrugged. Town hears everything badly and repeats it worse. "I heard enough to know there was a candle." So someday, candles. It was not a bargain. It was a shelf Doris had built in the future and placed Tess's dignity on it before Tess could drop it. After that, the bags continued, not daily, never predictably enough to become dependence. Beans, stale bread, soup bones, a bruised pear. Once, a small paper twist of salt and pepper, which made Tess sit on the office floor longer than necessary because the luxury of seasoning had become nearly embarrassing. Caleb Pike arrived with a splitting maul over one shoulder and a Schwinn bicycle left in the gravel by the gate. He was 16 or perhaps 17, tall in the unfinished way of boys who had recently outgrown their own confidence. His wrists showed below his jacket sleeves. His hair fell into his eyes no matter how often he pushed it back. The bicycle was green, with taped handlebars and a dented chrome fender that rattled when he walked it. A milk crate had been wired over the rear wheel, carrying work gloves, a coil of rope, and 2 apples. Tess found him at the woodpile behind the atelier, studying it as if choosing where an argument should begin. "Can I help you?" she asked. He startled, then tried to pretend he had not. "My mother said you need wood split." Tess looked toward the road. "Who is your mother?" "Mrs. Pike. She cleans at the church Tuesdays," she said. "About your grandfather." Tess did not correct the relation by then. She had learned that family in a town could become a practical category, not a legal one. Miriam had been called aunt by people who knew better. Clara had welcomed kin and not kin alike. If a boy arrived with a maul because his mother had connected a name to a kindness, the exact branch did not matter. "I cannot pay you much," Tess said. "I am not taking money." "You should," he set his jaw. "My mother said," that apparently settled the matter, at least for him. Caleb split poorly at first, too much shoulder, not enough stance. The maul struck off centre and bounced. Tess knew little of splitting beyond what August had shown her, but she knew enough to step back and let the wood teach what words could not. After 3 bad strikes, Caleb stopped, breathing hard, cheeks red from cold and embarrassment. "Move your left foot," she said. He did. "Let the weight fall." "I am." "You're throwing it." He glared at the round as if it had insulted him. On the next swing, the maul entered clean and the wood split with a sound that pleased both of them too much to show. Caleb stacked the halves under the lean-to, bark side up, air between rows, while Tess carried smaller pieces inside. He came again the next Saturday, then on 2 Wednesdays after school, always leaving before dusk, always refusing food until Doris learned of it and sent an extra bag marked for the boy with the bike. He took that because refusing Doris required more architecture than he possessed. Reverend Boyd walked past every morning at 7:10. Not 7, not 7:15, 7:10, close enough to train time, though no train stopped there any more. He was a spare man in a black wool coat rubbed shiny at the elbows, with a brown scarf and a hat he tipped to every living thing. Tess, the walnut, the dog from Bartlett Street, if it had followed a scent that far, even the building itself once snow began to melt from the eaves. He led the white church on Main Street, though Tess did not attend. He did not invite her. That was one reason she did not avoid him. The first morning he passed, she was carrying ash to the edge of the woods. He lifted his hat. Miss Calder. She nearly dropped the bucket. No one had said her name that way in the road, as if it belonged beside morning. "Good morning," she answered. He walked on. The next morning, he tipped his hat again. "Mercy keep you." 4 words. No sermon followed. No question about salvation. No inquiry about whether she had warm enough blankets, though she suspected Doris had already answered that on her behalf. Just 4 words placed in the air between the quarry spur and the marsh, then carried onward with him toward town. After a week, Tess began expecting him. On mornings when she worked outside, she lifted a hand before he spoke. On mornings when she was inside, she heard the rhythm of his steps on gravel and watched his hat pass the office window. Once after freezing rain, he stopped to scatter sand from a coffee can over the worst patch near the gate, then continued without waiting to be thanked. Later she learned he had served in Korea as a young chaplain's assistant, though he never mentioned it near the medal. Later she learned he had buried August Bell's wife, married Doris's daughter, and kept a list of elderly parishioners who needed furnace filters changed before winter. At the time he was only the man who passed each morning and left 4 words behind like kindling. "Mercy keep you." Tess never knew what to answer, so she worked in a manner that made the words less wasted. The cellar waited until February 11th because Tess had learned not to open downward spaces, simply because curiosity had begun knocking. There had been enough above-ground work to occupy every hour: roof, chimney, windows, plaster floors, firewood, water, food, county letters, ledger lines. The cellar door stood behind the storage alcove, low and thick, its strap hinges red with rust. A chain had been looped through the handle and fastened to a wall ring, though the padlock had long ago failed and hung open, more symbol than guard. She had passed it many times. She had touched the door twice. She had not opened it. On the morning of February 11th, the weather turned clear and brittle, and the office had enough daylight to work without the lantern. Tess swept the alcove, moved 2 boxes of unusable paper patterns, and brought the cold chisel, hammer, lantern, rope, and a length of board. She told Eli where she would be working. He did not offer to come at once, but he did set down the pipe fitting he was holding and look at her over his glasses. Door first. Air second. Stairs third. You fourth. Yes, sir. And if the air smells wrong, you leave. Yes, sir. The cellar door scraped against the floor but opened. Air came up cold and dry, not rotten, not sweet with gas, not wet with deep mould. Tess waited anyway. She held the lantern at the opening and watched the flame. It leaned slightly in the draught, but did not gutter. The stairs descended along a stone wall, 7 granite steps worn low in the middle. They were narrower than modern stairs, steep enough to require one hand on the wall. At the bottom, the light found a fieldstone floor. She tied the rope around the door ring. Not because rope could save her from foolishness once committed, but because habits of caution build fences where fear forgets them. The cellar measured 12 feet by 15, larger than she expected and lower than comfort allowed. The foundation walls were fieldstone, the mortar soft and pale. The floor had been laid with flat stones, not poured concrete, each one fitted into its neighbour with irregular patience. Shelves lined the east wall, mostly empty except for broken jars, 2 iron brackets, a crate of clay flower pots, and a small heap of coal that stained the corner black. In the centre of the floor lay a single dressed granite slab. It did not match the fieldstone around it. It was rectangular, about 3 feet by 2, pale grey, with edges cut clean and set slightly proud of the surrounding floor. Near one corner was the carved craft mark, the circle crossed by 2 fine lines, deeper than the marks upstairs. Deliberate. Protected. Tess stood over it a long while. Then she did not touch it. A granite slab in the centre of a cellar was a question too large for a day, already full of unknowns. It might cover a cistern, a drain, a burial of scrap, a structural void or some part of the atelier's history that required more than curiosity and a cold lantern. She had lifted one hidden place and found a life that did not give her permission to become greedy with every sealed thing. She copied it in the ledger. Cellar centre, dressed granite slab. Craft mark. Do not lift. Future. The important discovery came not at the centre, but on the stairs going up. She had finished measuring the cellar and was climbing with the lantern in her left hand, when the third step shifted under her boot. Not much. Only a small knock stone against wood, or wood against stone where no wood should have been. Tess stopped, backed down 1 step, and examined the underside of the third granite tread. There, wedged into a shadowed pocket between the stair support and the wall, sat a small oak box. It was no larger than a brick, dark with age, its lid warped slightly but intact. No lock, no ribbon, only dust, spider husks, and the faint smell of dry oak when Tess worked it free. She carried it upstairs before opening it, because cellars deserved respect, and because discoveries should meet full daylight when possible. The lid lifted with a soft crack. Inside lay a brass key and a tintype photograph. The key had a long narrow shaft, and a bow shaped like the atelier's craft mark, a circle crossed by 2 fine lines. It had been wrapped in linen that had yellowed but not rotted. The metal had dulled to a deep brown gold, with brighter edges where the wrapping had rubbed. Tess held it by the shaft and felt its weight, which was not large but seemed specific. A key made for 1 lock, a patient lock. The tintype was tucked beneath the linen. She lifted it by its edges and carried it to the window. A young woman looked out from the small dark plate with Tess's face. Not exactly, no likeness across time is exact. The woman's chin was firmer, her hair parted in the middle and pinned beneath a plain hat, her waist drawn by the fashion of another century. But the eyes, the set of the mouth when asked not to smile, the slight inward turn of one shoulder, the long fingers wrapped around a glass cutter held upright like a pen, those belonged to a pattern Tess could feel before she could name it. Behind the woman stood the atelier. Newer. Sharper. The brick clean. The sign whole above the doors. The walnut tree in the background was slim enough for a person to circle with 2 hands. Sunlight struck the atrium dome, and the glass above the workroom shone in dozens of careful planes. Tess turned the tintype over. On the back, written on a paper label browned with age, were the words, Eleanor Vale Calder, daughter of Nathaniel Vale, age 25, summer of 1903. Eleanor. Tess sat down on the office floor because the room had tilted in no physical way, and yet standing seemed unnecessary. Her own middle name had come from Lillian, or so she had been told, a family name her mother once said, without knowing which family or not caring enough to say. Eleanor Vale Calder had stood before this cottage in 1903, holding a tool of the trade, and the face had travelled forward through marriages, deaths, legal papers, lost ledgers, hidden money, a broken Toyota, and a $1 deed. The key she placed on the mantel. Not in her pocket. Not in the hidden drawer. Not with the cash. On the mantel, where she could see it while feeding the stove and remember that not every question had to be answered the day it was discovered. She did not yet know what it opened. For once, not knowing felt less like danger than promise. Spring did not arrive as a declaration. It retreated winter by inches. First the snow pulled back from the south side of the atelier, revealing flattened grass, walnut shells and the dark line where Tess had walked daily between the door and the woodpile. Then the creek grew loud with snowmelt, no longer a hidden thread beneath ice, but a brown, hurried voice moving toward the marsh. The trench outside the atrium cleared itself after rain, carrying silt toward the old outlet, as if grateful to have remembered its purpose. In March, the walnut released catkins, small and green-brown, hanging from the branches like quiet punctuation. The lilac by the front wall showed tight buds along its old wood. Birds began inspecting the broken cornice with an interest, Tess discouraged, by closing gaps with scrap screen. A building in repair could not become a nursery everywhere it wished. The county sent a second notice. This one stated that visible stabilization had been observed, though full compliance remained pending. Tess read the sentence 3 times, not because it was warm, but because it was official and not hostile. Margaret had written a note by hand at the bottom, continue documenting repairs. Photographs help. Tess borrowed Eli's camera and took 12 photographs. Roof patch, chimney pointing, reglazed windows, cleared trench, secured front doors, stove installation, floor restoration, plaster patches, temporary atrium cover, exterior drainage, waste removal, and one of the old sign because she could not help herself. By April, the office could be called habitable by a generous person and survivable by an honest one. Tess had enough heat on cold nights, enough dry floor for sleep, enough stored water for weather, and enough work ahead to keep pride from becoming comfortable. The atrium dome remained broken. The craft benches remained mostly unready. The drawings stayed wrapped between boards except when she studied them with washed hands and dry air. She decided not to begin the glass trade that spring. The decision cost her less than she expected. Earlier she might have mistaken the tools for a command, the hidden cash for urgency, the letter for permission to hurry. But Clara's instructions had been clearer than any romance of inheritance. Begin with water. Do not flatter glass until the roof can carry rain. Spend slowly. Measure again. So Tess would practice first. She would order small pieces of waste glass. Zinc came, copper foil, and proper glazing points with 1 coin sold through Eli's cousin, a coin dealer in Hartford who gave a written receipt and did not ask too many questions. 1 coin only, not the rarest, not the oldest. Enough to buy materials without touching the bundles meant to hold the building back from demolition. She would cut samples no larger than her palm, straight lines until they were true, curves until they no longer frightened her, putty lines on scrap sash, solder joints on waste metal, drawings copied by hand before any original left its folder. Every skill returned in modest pieces, as weather allowed. On the first warm afternoon of April, Tess opened all 4 office windows that could safely open. Air moved through the room and lifted the edge of the county map. The sash cords whispered over their pulleys. Outside, the creek spoke loudly through the trees, and somewhere near the marsh, a red-winged blackbird made a sound like rusty hinges becoming music. Tess stood beside the work table with the brass key on the mantel behind her, the tintype wrapped safely in the drawer, the letter beneath the portfolio boards, and the heirloom glass cutter resting in its cloth. The house was patient. So was she? 2 winters later, in December 2024, the first completed skylight left the atelier in the back of Eli Harkness's truck, wrapped in quilted moving blankets and tied down with cotton webbing. It was not large that mattered to Tess. Her first honest commission was not a mansion atrium, not a glass dome, not the kind of work that would make a photograph travel farther than the truth. It was a rectangular hall skylight for a Victorian house on Garden Street in Wethersfield, 42 inches by 28, built to replace a failed plastic bubble that had yellowed, cracked, and dripped into the upstairs landing every March. The owner had found Tess's index card on the cafe corkboard. Repairs to heritage skylights, storm glazing, sash, and atrium leaks. Calder and Vale. Written estimates. Patient work. The card was plain cream stock, no logo beyond the small circle and cross mark. Tess had learned to draw from the seal. Doris had pinned it between a notice for piano lessons and a flyer for a lost grey cat. For 3 weeks no one called, then one person did, then another mailed photographs. Then a woman from Old Saybrook brought a cracked transom wrapped in a bath towel and said her grandmother had always meant to fix it. The Wethersfield skylight was the first new piece made start to finish. Tess had built it from zinc bars, restored corner brackets, new safety glass on the outer layer, and salvaged wavy glass beneath where it would show from the hall. The curb was flashed in copper. The vent channel followed Clara's drawing, adjusted for the modern roof, but not made ugly by that adjustment. Tess had warmed the shop to 56 degrees before bending the came, had scored each pane with one true pass, had bedded the glass in putty work to satin by hand, and had let the glazing cure longer than impatience advised. On the morning it left, light struck the finished piece through the atrium's repaired temporary panels and scattered itself across the work table in narrow pale bands. Eli stood beside the truck, older now in small visible ways, his shoulders still square but slower when he lifted. Caleb, home from his first semester at community college, held the rear blanket while Tess checked the straps one more time. August Bell had died the previous summer after a short illness, but his roofing hatchet hung above the office counter, returned and then given back by Eli with no speech attached. Tess pressed one palm against the wrapped skylight. It did not feel like success in the public sense. It felt like a line held true. Inside, the atelier had become a place a person could enter without apology. The front office walls were lime-washed in a warm off-white that did not hide the old plaster seams. The pine floor, oiled and darkened by use, carried scratches from boots, crates, chair legs, and one dropped clamp that had left a crescent mark near the counter. The cast-iron stove had a new rope gasket and a stovepipe properly fitted. The pigeonholes held invoices again, not many, but enough to bend some corners. Above the counter hung 3 framed drawings, Clara's atrium plan, Miriam's old lesson sketch copied from memory, and Tess's own measured drawing of the restored front windows. The workroom still carried scars. No honest restoration removes all evidence of survival. The atrium dome had not been fully rebuilt, only stabilized with repaired ribs, temporary glazed panels, and a weatherproof cover over the worst sections while Tess saved for the final curved glass. The drainage trench ran clear. The central table had been planed, patched and sealed, its burn mark preserved beneath a thin coat of oil. The glass racks held new sheets, salvaged panes and labelled scraps sorted by thickness and tint. The tools from the hidden compartment lay in a drawer lined with wool, brought out for real work and cleaned before being put away. The brass key remained on the mantel for nearly 2 years before it found its lock. It happened after the first heavy snow of that December, when ice weighed the walnut branches and one lower limb cracked under its own burden. Tess heard it during supper, a long wooden complaint followed by a muffled fall. In the morning she went out with the pruning saw, intending only to clean the break before rot entered the trunk. The fallen limb had torn away a strip of old bark near the horseshoe. Behind the wound, where the tree had slowly grown around iron and memory, a small brass plate showed through. It had been set into the trunk long ago, then swallowed almost completely by living wood. Only the edge was visible at first, green-brown and curved. Tess brushed snow from the bark with her glove, then fetched warm water, a cloth and the lantern. The plate bore the craft mark. Below it was a narrow keyhole. For several minutes she stood in the snow with her breath rising and the saw lying forgotten at her feet. Then she went inside, took the brass key from the mantel, and returned without hurrying. The key entered reluctantly, not because it was wrong, but because years had pressed bark and weather around the plate. Tess worked it gently, no force, no pride. A little oil, a little waiting. The key turned. A section of the old trunk opened inward. Not deeply, only enough to reveal a hollow that had been cut or grown around, lined with tin, then sealed behind the brass plate before the walnut had taken it into itself. Inside lay a folded 48-star flag, wrapped in oilcloth, and a note in Clara's upright hand, older than the long letter but unmistakable. The flag was small, service-sized, its cotton softened by time, its stars arranged in neat rows from a country that had once counted fewer states and more certainty than it deserved. Tess unfolded only a corner, then stopped, afraid her breath alone might damage it. She opened the note instead. For Joseph, when he returns, if he does not. For the one who will remember without making display. Folded here, December 1945, after the telegram was corrected and before winter closed the road. CVC. Tess read it once. The phrase after the telegram was corrected would take research to understand. Joseph had returned, the letter had said, but ruined in body by cold and smoke. Perhaps for a time the family had been told otherwise. Perhaps the flag had been prepared for a death that did not come in the official manner but arrived slowly afterward, carried in lungs and sleep, and the silence men brought home from war. She did not invent the story beyond the facts given. That had become one of her disciplines. A person could dishonour the dead by making them more convenient for feeling than they had been in life. She carried the flag inside in both hands and placed it on the central table. The note went beside Joseph's medal, still kept in its tin and now properly identified after 2 winters of careful inquiry. A World War II service medal, modest in market value, immeasurable in context. Tess had written to the State Archive, searched military records at the library, and learned enough to know that Joseph Vale Calder had served, returned, and been buried in Indian Hill Cemetery in Middletown after his death in 1948. On May 30th, 2025, Memorial Day as the town observed it that year, Tess took the medal and the small folded flag to the cemetery. She did not carry flowers from a store. She cut lilac from the bush by the atelier, because it had survived against the front brick, and because its scent seemed old enough for the errand. Reverend Boyd went with her, not as ceremony, only as witness. He stood 2 paces back while she found the stone. Joseph V. Calder, 1920 to 1948. Son, craftsman, soldier. The grave had grass over it. Neat and ordinary. Tess brushed lichen from the lower edge with a soft cloth. She set the lilac against the stone, laid the medal tin beside it for the length of one silence, then picked it back up. Clara had not asked that it be surrendered to weather. Joseph had said medals were metal, unless somebody remembered the cost without speeches, so Tess gave him no speech. Reverend Boyd removed his hat. "Mercy keep him," he said. 4 words again. They were enough. The money remained mostly where it had been found, though not in the drainage trench. Tess had moved it after the first spring into a bank account requiring 2 signatures, hers and Eli's at first, later hers and Doris's after Eli admitted he disliked banks more than wisdom allowed. The account was labelled in Tess's ledger not as savings, not as emergency fund, not as inheritance, but as for the next one. It was meant for the building first, and for future hands after that. She spent only 3 to 5 coins from the cash in those early years, depending how one counted the trade that brought materials without touching paper money. 1 Franklin $half sold to buy practice glass, zinc, copper ties, and proper flux. 1 silver quarter given in exchange for a bundle of old sash weights from a salvage yard owner who collected coins and respected quiet bargains. 1 mercury dime traded to Eli's cousin for written appraisal help, though the cousin later returned the dime in an envelope, saying he had charged his conscience instead. 2 ordinary wheat pennies, not rare, were set into the underside of the restored office counter beneath a small strip of wood, one from the year the atelier opened, one from the year Tess arrived. They were not spent. They were placed, the bundles of paper money, after professional advice and more caution than drama permits, remained sealed in archival sleeves within the account's deposit box, documented, photographed, and taxed properly where required. Tess kept copies of everything. Clara had written spend slowly, account for every dollar. Tess did. No new car appeared, no polished wardrobe, no bright sign lit by electricity. She bought boots that did not leak, a proper winter coat, safe scaffolding, restoration materials, permit fees, insurance, food enough to stop measuring hunger as a daily weather system, and slowly, very slowly, the right glass for the dome. The shop reopened by whisper rather than announcement. First Doris's corkboard index card, then a second card at Harkness and Son beside the furnace filter schedule, then a listing in the Preservation Society newsletter after Margaret Dunleavy, retired by then but still exact, sent the editor a note that did not ask permission. Tess received inquiries by mail because she preferred paper records. Later she allowed a simple phone line installed in the office, its bell quiet enough not to startle the room. By the end of the second winter, the mailing list held 43 names. Not customers exactly. Some were homeowners with broken storm sash. Some were people restoring old houses one paycheck at a time. Some only wanted to know when the atrium dome would be open for a spring viewing, though Tess never promised a viewing and never used the word event. One woman wrote from Vermont asking whether daylight roofs could truly reduce lamp use in a north-facing hall. Tess answered with 2 pages, a sketch, and Clara's old principle translated into modern caution. The atelier worked 3 days a week for outside jobs and 3 days for itself. The 7th day, Tess tried not to work, and failed modestly. Caleb returned on a mild April afternoon carrying a hand-carved wooden sign wrapped in a moving blanket and tied to the back of his truck. The Schwinn long retired but not discarded. He had grown broader, steadier, still with hair that fell into his eyes when concentration lowered his head. He had studied carpentry at the community college, worked weekends for a cabinet maker, and begun making signs for farms and stores whose owners disliked vinyl more than they liked paying promptly. He would not let Tess see it until he had fixed the hanging hooks. She stood in the gravel while he climbed the ladder beneath the repaired iron canopy. Doris watched from near the gate with a jar of lemonade. Eli sat on an overturned crate, pretending he had come only to inspect the hardware. Reverend Boyd stood beside the walnut with his hat in both hands. Margaret Dunleavy, now wearing a blue coat instead of county office oatmeal, had brought a paper envelope and said nothing about what was inside. Caleb lifted the blanket away. The sign was modest in size, cedar with raised letters painted deep green and cream. Not polished like a boutique sign. Not rustic by performance. It looked as if it had always intended to weather. Calder and Vale Skylight Works. Atriums. Sash. Storm glazing. Daughters. Tess read the last line once. Then again. Plural, Caleb said from the ladder. Not looking down. I see that. My mother said names should leave room. Doris made a sound that might have been a cough. Eli looked toward the road. Reverend Boyd lowered his head. Margaret opened the envelope and removed the $1 bill Tess had paid at the county office, still in its marked sleeve, still carrying the parcel number in Margaret's severe hand. I retired the drawer, Margaret said. This belongs near the deed copy. Tess took the envelope carefully. You were supposed to keep it. I did. Long enough. The sign moved slightly in the breeze. Daughters. Not daughter, singular, as if Tess were the final answer to a family line. Daughters, plural, because the work might pass by blood, by teaching, by welcome, by a girl not yet born, by a boy's child, by a stranger who opened a drain and did not mistake it for refuse. The word made room without demanding that anyone fill it quickly. That evening, after everyone left, Tess sat at the office counter beneath the restored window and began her own letter. She did not write because she was dying. She did not write because the building had been completed. It had not. The atrium dome still needed its final curved panes. The cellar slab still waited under the fieldstone floor, marked future in the ledger. The mailing list had more questions than she could answer. The roof would need full slate work someday. The trade remained larger than her hands. She wrote, because waiting is not the same as postponing care. The first sheet was cream paper from the stationery store near Main Street. The pen had belonged to Miriam, recovered in no grand way, but purchased quietly from the estate auction records after years of wondering where the drafting box had gone. Most of Miriam's tools were lost. One pen had returned. That was enough to begin. Tess dated the page. Then she wrote the first words exactly as Clara had written them. My dear one, whoever you are. She stopped there for a long while, not from lack of words, but from respect for what those words opened. Outside, April rain began, soft and brief. It struck the repaired panes over the front office and travelled where it should, down glass along putty bevel, over flashing, into the cleared trench, away from the foundation. The building received it without panic. The stove clicked as it cooled. The brass key lay on the mantel again after its service in the walnut. The tintype rested in the drawer. Joseph's medal tin sat beside the copied records. The $1 bill, returned from Margaret's drawer, lay flat beneath a small pane of salvaged glass on the counter, not displayed to visitors, only kept where Tess could see it when accounts became difficult. She wrote the second sentence. If you have found this place after me, begin with water. The line pleased her because it was not pretty first. It was true first. Years would decide the rest, not the county, not Grant Voss, who never returned and did not need to, not the vanished estate papers, not the broken Toyota, not the rooms where Lillian had lowered her eyes. Those belonged to another weather now. The building had helped Tess survive without asking her to keep standing in it. She continued writing in the quiet office. Vone measured line after another. She wrote of the roof and the chimney, of Eli's ledger, Doris's paper bags, Caleb's first clean split of wood, August Bell's 3-stroke nail, Reverend Boyd's 4 words, Margaret's brass stamp, Miriam's glass cutter, Clara's letter, Eleanor's tintype, Joseph's flag, the horseshoe in the walnut, and the granite slab in the cellar that must not be lifted without 2 witnesses, good light, dry weather, and humility. She wrote down the account numbers and where not to spend from them. She wrote which windows were original, which were replacements, which panes carried bubbles worth preserving, which boards complained in damp weather, which hinge on the rear door needed oil before winter, which neighbour's dog could open the gate if the latch was not set twice. Inheritance, she had learned, was mostly instruction made generous. When the page filled, she set it aside to dry and began another. The atrium beyond the office had darkened, but not completely, even under clouds. The repaired temporary panels held a faint grey light above the central table. It came down gently, through glass new and old, through work finished and unfinished, through the patient geometry of ribs waiting for their final panes. Tess looked up from the letter. For a moment she saw the room as it had been, as it was, and as it might yet become. Not restored beyond use, not preserved as a museum for people to admire and leave unchanged. Alive in the honest way of places where water is watched, tools are cleaned, names are written, and light is asked to work. The skylight and atrium atelier waits. It has always waited. And in the county office, in a drawer, Margaret Dunleavy's successor still did not fully understand. There remained a note in severe handwriting explaining why one marked envelope should never be thrown away, even though the dollar bill itself had gone home at last.